have a broader look at this thing. Sometimes I guess the reality of living here forces you to go deeper and deeper among yourselves. But when you reflect that this is a challenge that is not only a continental challenge and we're trying to raise, we have now developed something called the Africa Social Protection Strategy up to 2025. And the goal of that strategy is to lift this percentage from 17% to 40%. Very ambitious. Hopefully it will be done. And for us, therefore, you asked me, Program Director, to talk about partnership. South Africa is already at the front. I hope you always keep that at the back of your minds, especially when the difficult discussions become very difficult and painful. A little bit on the pat on yourselves' backs to encourage you to continue to go, I think, would do you a world of good. And I know I'm in a dangerous place, but I'm always astounded as a UN diplomat, the negativity that covers a debate like this. And yet, at the heart of it is that actually you are dealing with a big challenge, but you are on the right path, number one. Number two, you are doing quite well on that path. So this Africa strategy is the context. To us, therefore, the positive impact of social protection and we therefore associate ourselves with evidence-based policy making and partnering with universities. And I want to thank in this regard the intellectual capital that has been brought to this report by the panel. And allow me to make a few points on this. The fact is that the question is no longer should we. The question is how best can we? That's not to dismiss the cost challenge. That's not to dismiss those who question the feasibility, the financial feasibility, and long-term sustainability and viability. But the question is no longer should we, but how best can we? In this regard, the academic excellence that you have, most of this work, wherever else we are dealing with it, and there is no country that we are not busy with social protection, whether it's in the so-called developing world or in the developed world, globally, and also in our region. And you may want to know even among your neighbors. In Lesotho, we are trying to help them work on a social protection policy for the past 20 years. In Botswana, we are busy with it. In Eswatini, we are busy with it. In Zimbabwe, we are busy with it. In Namibia. But there's one distinguishing issue. Here we have a 7-member panel, and they are yourselves. They are from academic institutions in this country. That is already also a big plus. Elsewhere, we struggle to get intellectual capacity that understands the local context. This capacity and the report that is therefore before you is a product of your own discussing an issue that is very close to all your hearts. And for us, we are happy to facilitate, to make intellectual capacity, and therefore I really want to thank the panel and to say that in that regard, you have excellent evidence-based policy making. Probably it doesn't get better than this. Sovereignty of policy making, legislation adoption of the national authorities. Ours is to help you bring this global perspective. Ours is to help you bring this African perspective within and amongst yourselves. Therefore, this report...
Somebody who has many, many years of experience in this field. He is the now Madala custodian of, of information. He is an encyclopedia when it comes to matters of social grants development. And that's Mr. Sawan Jahoma. He's with the Global Institute in Social Grants Policy Development, Management and Training. He studied government policy as a former Deputy Director General for Social Security. how social security works in over 30 countries. South Africa fits into this global picture and set an appropriate scene for us. Mr. Jahoma, the floor is yours. Please, let's give him a round. Why are you acting shy? Come on stage. Let's give him a round of applause.
Kathy Moslaslana. That adulation is more than my experience can bear. Let me recognize the Honorable Minister, who I have said at the previous launch of a meeting, really inspires an older man like me. To the director. Since I was a director, I realized only afterwards that he had also interviewed me. I don't know why he supported my candidacy for the job then, but it's probably because he saw someone he could put through hell and fire. But it's been a great journey, and I think quite often we lose sight of journey has really been part of our democratic revolution, our change. And in 19, of course, that of the intense debate that went on in the 1997 conference of the governing party around a comprehensive social security system. But that debate and call it the battle went further back, and that I could get from the late former Minister Zola Skweyiya, how Section 27 was debated and fought over during the constitutional negotiations, because it was then said that everyone will be entitled, and of course the powers that be then said it can't be. The powers that be then had implemented a comprehensive social security system decades ago, starting, I suppose, more formally and structured in 1919 after the end of the First World War, and in 1928 introduced the old age grant, in 1930 introduced the disability grant, and we went further. So that when we came to change, when it came to our turn to change the system, there was objection to a comprehensive social security system. But the ANC, or the governing party in 1997, captured it in a set of resolutions, which then led to the formation of the Taylor Committee, of which was led by Professor Taylor and the likes of Alex and many, Fezile Makiwani, many respected academics and non-academics, Mike Masuta, amongst others, charted the way into a report, the Taylor report, that is still today such a rich source. And it propelled the debate. So came 2000, the committee was hard at work. I joined government, and in 2002, the report came out. And the proposal then was for a basic income grant. But it caused quite a stir. In part, I think it was about communication. And in part, also ideological fights. And in fact, that's part of the debate that's always left out. There's ideology here. When people say we'd rather give more money for public works, then it's because ideologically, and I've sat in the midst of those offices where money decisions are made, and we were told you're going to create a group of people that are lazy. There's no evidence to prove it, but that was said 2002. And so the debate continued since then into 2005, when we proposed a more comprehensive reform over and above the basic income grant, and that was retirement reforms and all other sorts of reforms. And I think the gloves really came off at that time, because we now said, we're going to push for this. I think, again, drawing on Dr. Zola Skweyiya's, shall I call it bravery, to speak out and say we needed a basic income grant. And that really set the stage for ongoing and persistent work, which we did almost on every year, pushing. And of course, starting with the child support grant, which was what the committee initially proposed in 2002, that led to the extension of the grant to children over 18. We realized that it had to be. And so research continued into it. But I must say the research that has come to the fore now is so rigorous that the debate is no longer about, is there evidence? There's no reason to argue for the evidence. It is there. And this report really is class. It's there where we would want it to be and steer the debate forward. And I think it has come at a good time when we face similar crises that we had when social security really grew in the country. 1928 was a crisis. Afrikaner poverty was so widespread that the then government had to decide it. In 1942, again, crisis period, and South Africa decided we needed more social security, but at that stage decided it was only going to be for white people. And it's there captured in the documents at Parliament, where the decision was explicitly, black people don't need income support. They can live off the land. Of course, by then, lots of disposition had taken place. Here we are. This is history. This is history. And we would want you to capture this moment and remember it. And when I say that, it's because previous periods of history has been quite beneficial to me. When we ended the rollout of the child support grant, I left government and had probably the good fortune of being one of the people who had contributed to the child support grant expansion. And when Dr. Johnny speaks about the impact of this beyond South Africa, it's true. Since then, I spent 8 years in different countries, mostly providing advice and support on expansion of the child support grant, up to Tabani in China, where we were in 2013. This is history, not said before, but a lot more louder. And so, Madam Moderator, thank you for your time. I now leave it open to you to set the scene further. Thank you so much.
Jehoma. Nothing quite set a moderator into panic. Like the moment where you see your next speaker walk, and you're like, no, wait, stop him, close the door, let him come back in. We were, of course, supposed to be hearing from just the impact of this social relief of distress grant, because the debate I often find, and it's very difficult to have this conversation. I was one of those who was on the fence. I knew that, yes, we need some kind of social security program, but at the same time, I was persuaded by arguments about where we're going to get the money from. Until I did an interview with Isabel. It was probably just before we got into the pandemic. And anybody knows, you get into a debate with Isabel and you walk out of it and you're like, okay, fine, Isabel, you win. I'm sorry that I made the stupid suggestion, though, even asked these stupid questions in the first place. And there's no other way of appreciating the impact of this grant if you don't put yourself in the shoes of those who are receiving it. And that's really what Mr. Moyo is also going to give us a context of. Because yes, it's 350. And while that is a milestone to be celebrated, again, you'll have the likes of Isabel in the background saying, who can live on 350 Rand a month? It's not enough. And of course, the national debate then rages on about, well, then how much is enough? So let's then get a sense of, number one, what is the impact, but where are the biggest gaps where this grant is concerned? General A. Moyo Venda, a resident in the informal settlement of Makause in Ekurhuleni. He's an activist in various organizations, and he also is part of the hashtag Pay the Grants campaign. Tata Moyo, I'm going to invite you to come on stage and tell us why hashtag the grants must be paid. To take on the stage.
Thank you, Program Director, and greetings to all. I think it confuses me, even myself and my organization, on the issues that we are talking to. I have the BIS, which is the basic income support, and we have the BIG, of which the minister was also referring to, the basic income guarantee, and we also have the UBIG advocating for. But the SRD challenges are mostly common across the country. Since the beginning of this year, approved but not being paid, meaning the crisis have escalated from bad to worse. I remember when we had this discussion or the first panel report in Pretoria sometime last year, we went back hoping that things will be better or will be improved. Taking from the crisis that we had last year around many issues that we raised as the payday grants to SASSA. But we found that many of those issues, instead of being solved, they have escalated to be more crisis after a crisis. As you were saying, the program director, that I forget the lady that you were referring to, that used to say the 350 is nothing. The 350 has no value in this rising cost of living. Currently, we're all sitting here and knowing how expensive it is to survive, more especially for us as the poor and unemployed. I think for some of you, it might be easier, even with the high cost of food, petrol, and all of those things. But for us, it hit on us 3 times worse than everybody else sitting in this room. Maybe to explain why I'm saying that, if you check how much is this 350 per month, is equals to 11 rand a day, which cannot even afford a loaf of bread, which cannot even afford a liter of paraffin, which cannot even afford a data that you require to use in terms of appealing this SRD declinement and so forth and so forth. Those are some of the challenges that we are facing. But I'm here supposed to speak on the impacts and the gaps of the SRD today, to contextualize the work of this panel. Yet the truth is that this year, there has been more gaps than impact. This year has been one long horror story of exclusion and pain for beneficiaries. This year has painted better than any research paper or presentation the reality of targeting or means testing. That is why, as the payday grants, we've been advocating for universality of this grant, universal basic income guarantee. The reality of targeting or means testing. On the paper, they are talk of necessary method or efficiency or a moralistic defense against the underlying undeserving poor. In the real world, this means children dying of starvation because their parents could not overcome the anti-poor barriers set against them. In the real world, this means a black Christmas for us. For us and many who have not even received their April payments. They are still approved, but not yet been paid. Some in their SMSs, it shows that there is money. But when you go to the shops, your ShopRite, your retail stores, you get nothing. You are told that the money is not in. But in your phone, the money is there. So we'll be facing that Black Christmas. Unless we fight this, the gap will continue to grow and the noose will continue to tighten, making income scary universal rights. Income security, a universal right, is the way we fight this. However, that requires a greater gap to be filled, the gap of necessary policy. And hopefully, that is what today fed us. We should not put ourselves on the back for being here when we should be so much further already. As the previous speaker spoke, that this debate or talks doesn't start today or this year. We even remember there were some talks about the so-called job-seeking grants, your family grants, all of those that we've been rejecting. And we've been clear in saying what we need is the clear policy direction that will take us to the transition from these SRD grants to the permanent policy or permanent drive that will lead us to the SRD replacement or the universal basic income grant that we've been calling for. If you look at what we are currently facing with this 350, you find people traveling the back and forth trying to access this 350. You end up spending more than the 350 that you are looking for, trying to access it. So those are the challenges that many of our communities, especially in rural areas, with this high cost of transport, you find that the single trip to the pay points is around 70 rand. So how much are you going to be left with if you take 70 rand going to access the money and you end up not having anything left for yourself? And you are expected to survive with that little change for a month. The president of the country, a few months back, was saying the ministers or his ministers cannot survive with 100,000 per month. But we are expected to survive a month with only 350 rand, which does not even buy you 5 items. If you go to those same retailers, your ShopRite, your Pick and Pay, you cannot even get 5 items with the change that you are left with. And the addition to that is those deductions that will be happening through these bank transactions. If you go withdraw your money, it is no longer that 350. Remember, there's bank charges to that 350s. So meaning that if they are sending you that 350, it's not actually to say you got a 350. You are closer to the 350. You are not getting a 350. So the collapse of the post office in terms of distributing these monies, it hit it hard on us as we are not taxed double again. Because the bank charges is like another taxes to the poor, while we've been calling for taxing the rich so that the poor can survive. But this goes the other way, goes against us again. We are supporting the banks. That also doesn't support us in terms of making sure that we survive, even if some went very harshly to go and open the bank account to make sure that they get this money. But the banks didn't withdraw or do away or make some indemnity for the poor who are getting these 350s to make sure that there's no bank charges. But they continue to charge us the withdrawal charges on those 350s, making it more difficult for the poor. If you check in some of those researches, it says it costs around 900 for a youth to look for job, that covering data, that covering transport cost, it's around 900 rand. So if you expect that people should get a 350 and go run looking for a job, it's something that might not happen, and it might not be something that we can see in near future. We are not saying, as many are saying, that the support grant will create the state of dependence or will make us lazy. There's no truth and there's no evidence to substantiate that. We've seen many people or many households in our communities who are relying on this 350, really surviving in saying, at least we have something. You know, with the 350, to take a child to crash, it only covers a transport, which is not even enough for transport. And with the high level of gender-based violence and femicide that we are experiencing today, is because women still have no source of income, have no independence. They are forced into these abusive relationships because they have no source of income. And those are some of the things that we are just overlooking. And we want to deal, or we are claiming to be dealing with this scourge of gender-based violence, but not looking in deeper into why is this thing happening, how we can curb this thing, or we can fight and combat this thing. Those are some of the things and examples that we, as the Pay the Grants campaign, we've been raising to say, President, honorable ministers, and everybody who have an ear to listen, can you listen to us and maybe try to work with us in terms of trying to find a solution, in terms of working together? At least some institutions and some departments and academics have been very much helpful in terms of coming closer to us and proving to us that, yes, you were right all along. Your arguments were right. This BIG, or Universal Basic Income grant that you are demanding, is feasible and is doable. And the only challenge that we are facing is these austerity measures. And we've said over and over again that the austerity measures should not come at the expense of service delivery when we demand this or push for this BIG. We are seeing now that there's a huge impact of these austerity measures. The cutting of budget is happening everywhere. And we are not quite sure with this extension of this SRD to 2024 that these discussions like this, or presentations or panel reports like this, will ever be implemented to make sure that one day we'll sit back and say, at least there is something that the government have thought for the poor. But for now, we have a reactionary government. We've seen their reaction when they reintroduced again the SRD after it was terminated. It was because of the July unrest. So we don't want to end up to those situations so that the government can start listening or responding. We want a government that knows the people, that understands how is the reality on the ground. But it seems like now we have a distant government that is very far from the realities that are happening on the ground or on the people. So we urge to the academics that are here that have been working hard on this kind of research and this kind of debates and discussions to make it a point. We know that the minister is listening. We know that the minister has been engaging with us. We've been writing to the minister. We've been toying and submitting memorandums. But we are here to say, let us go back to our people knowing what is the policy direction that will take us to the 2024 March in terms of the replacement of this SRD or the termination of the SRD. Because they only pronounce, like now they were pronouncing that the SRD will be terminated next year, March. But there is no thinking beyond the termination. What do we do? How the poor are going to survive? So the other thing that I would like to end with is that as the payday grants, we are not making these demands and hoping for favors from the state. We are making this based on the constitutionality or the constitutional rights that we have in this country. That if people cannot afford to take care of themselves, the state should intervene and make means that it assists the people. So we are facing millions of people out there that are sleeping on an empty stomach while others are dying of eating too much. So we need to be clear and we need to be in the same path. We cannot have a president that will have money stashed in the sofas, whereas people are expected to survive with 350 rand. That's a disgrace. Even the 1,500 rand that we are calling for, some people might think it's enough or it will be too much. That equals to 50 rand a day. And that 50 rand a day equals to one takeaway meal a day. And people are expected to eat at least 3 times a day. But we as the poor are expected to eat once a day. I thank you.
Thank you so much for that account, Mr. Moyo, and for really giving us perspective in terms of the work that you are doing to push for hashtag pay the grant. And I also want us to give him another round of applause because it's not easy standing up and telling your story in the way that he has. You know, sometimes, and I don't know if it's a South African phenomenon, because after what Johnny said, I must be careful, right? Because he says we must take a step back outside of ourselves. Because often we become so engrossed in what we think we are that we forget that perhaps we might be better off than others. But there is this almost expectation in South Africa that if you are poor, you have to perform your poverty. You have to show exactly how poor you are just before anything can be done to help you. And we forget that it's an incredibly vulnerable position for an individual to be in. And the Constitution says that we must help to protect the human dignity of each and every South African and restore that dignity. And I think that's part of why this work is so important, because it's saying, we see you, we see where you are, and we're taking the step to help cover you. And that's really why it's so important to acknowledge when people like Mr. Moyo come up and they tell their stories, they're honest about their experiences. It's not, it's not easy to come and be open like that. especially in front of an audience of this nature. So, Mr. Moyo, thank you so much. And I really appreciate the fact that you've shared your experience and those of others with us this morning. On that note, I'm going to invite the Acting Director General in the Department of Social Development, Mr. Linton Nkunu. We were scheduled to hear from him a little earlier, but of course he then did the job of introducing the minister and get his sense in terms of the direction that he believes the department can and should be taking where this conversation is concerned. Please, let's give him a round of applause.
Well, thank you very much once again, Program Director. And let me also appreciate the remarks by General Moyo, which I think, in all honesty, really give an account of the realities on the ground. And I wish sometimes, General Moyo, that we could take you and put you in some of the meetings that we attend, some of the FOSAD meetings that we attend, where we still have some people advocating against the continuation of the 350 grant, where we still have people forgetting about the realities on the ground and what people are really going through and really facing. I wish sometimes that, I said this in one of our meetings with all our directors general, and I said, sometimes I wish I could take you and put you on the ground and experience what's happening on the ground, so you could see for yourself, feel for yourself, understand for yourself, and never make a mistake of being so far removed from what's happening on the ground and the people and the challenges that our people are facing. So I want to thank General Moyo for those remarks. I think they were really, really powerful and bring some sense of reality to what we are dealing with here. And I hope that such messages infiltrate all policy-making areas. At times we are told, and let me say this, General Moyo, the reason why we have the difficulties that we have now with the 350 grant, we are paying how many? Just about 8 million, Brenton? Around there. Yet in the first iteration, we paid 11.5 million, 11.3 million. You know what's the reason for that? Yes, it's because we introduced the means testing. But the reason we introduced the means testing is because we were told, in no uncertain terms, that if you don't do this, you're not going to get the money. We were told. There's a reality. So we grappled with the idea of having to find a balancing act in terms of what to do around this. And to be honest with you, it's a difficult thing. And as the Department of Social Development, and I know the minister's still here, we remain committed to this cause. I want to say we will never deviate from this fight. The reason why you don't have a clear sense of what's going to happen in the future, and I can tell you now, and even my colleagues who we invited to be here are not here, but we go into meetings and say, but we need a sense of certainty in the long term. Can we not extend for the remainder of the MTech period? Can we extend this grant for at least the next 3 years to 5 years or so, to a place where we conclude areas around, the policy aspects around it? And we're told, nope, you can't. You're only going to get it for 1 year. So the implications of getting it for 1 year, Brenton will tell you, is that, and this is one of the reasons why this has been the most difficult iteration to implement. You would recall we paid 3 months late. We were about 3 or 4 months late, Brenton. How long? About 3? About 3 months late. What was the reason for that? It's because the contracts had come to an end during the third iteration, or the second iteration. The contracts had come to an end. We had to go back and renegotiate, and that takes a long time. We couldn't pay without having necessary contracts in place. But when we started drafting the regulations, we were very clear and said, guys, can we not stop this at the time that would come March 2022, so that it gives us space to proceed and not have a challenge around contractors, etc. We're told in no uncertain terms, you will implement what they call the legal requirements. That's what they said to us. And we went and fought this battle. And, so I'm saying it's a difficult task even for us, but we will not stop. We will soldier on. And even to the extent where we will ensure that we bring upon the introduction of the basic income grant. We're close to it. We're making steady progress towards it. And I think, Selwyn, the work that you guys have done, and by the way, Selwyn was one of the first people to write, when COVID started up, he was one of the first to write an article or advocating for the for bringing in the basic income grant during that time, during COVID-19, when we first faced the pandemic. I'm sure, Selwyn, the president may have gotten a hold of your paper and felt encouraged about it and decided, let's do this. So, but on a very serious note, I think these are things we need to look at. I also think that, and we were just having a conversation with Isabel. By the way, Prof. van Heerden, van de Heer, I forget how to pronounce, you'll forgive me. And Isabel, there are times, program director, when you can see there is a fight happening here now. And you can see those who are against the 350 grant are starting to wage this war. And it happens in the public space, in the media and other places. It's at that point where we say we need to bring in some heavy artillery now. And we bring in the likes of Prof. and Isabel and them to go and take them on. So, but I want to thank you for your continued commitment towards this cause as well. And not tiring in doing good as it relates to this work. And I think that we will get to the goal that we want at the end with your continued support. I also particularly appreciate the fact, as the minister indicated earlier, that we have a group of academics who are here. So, and really, as Moyo, what is his name? Johnny indicated earlier, that, there's a lot of intellectual capacity here. I'm confident that when you begin to take this report and put it out there, we have scientific backing and evidence-based research that will dispel a lot of the, what I call myths that are out there, issues around dependency, issues around, some of these things are just absurd, to be honest with you. Really, really just absurd. No science to them whatsoever. Some of the things are not tested. But I'm glad that the report that we have today is going to show you some science and really bring to light some of the realities that we face. I'm also particularly glad, Program Director, that you mentioned at the beginning some of the questions that people are asking about the grant. Can we fund it? Is it fundable? Where do we get the money from? And what are the best funding models to look at, etc.? How do you implement it from a policy perspective? And I can tell you that this report begins to shed some light on that. And so those who naysayers, for lack of a better word, or those who are still not confident around the different directions or the pathways or the various approaches that can be considered towards the basic income grant, I encourage you to read the report. It has some information in there that is quite interesting and quite astounding. This morning we had a conversation on the other side with the director, the global director of the World Bank for social protection and jobs. And one of the things he highlighted was the fact that South Africa doesn't have a social registry. And if we had a social registry, we would be able to better manage how we pay out to support, to provide social protection. I thought it was one of the interesting things that he mentioned. And I thought to myself, but we have the data. We have the gold. And the data that we have can begin to tell us a whole lot of interesting facts around what we can do with recipients on the 350 grant. And in a conversation with Isabel just a few minutes ago, I don't know if I'm at liberty to mention the name, but there is a company which happens to be a retailer which grew by 25% in the last quarter. Do you know the company? Should I say it? Let me not say it. But this company grew by over 25% in the last quarter. And they're benefiting largely, I want to believe, from grant recipients who go and collect their money from the shops and buy at those shops. It's ShopRite. They have grown. But Isabel poses a very interesting aspect here. She says, and as General Moyo is talking, around the bank charges, etc. And she says, but why can't ShopRite and all the retailers agree that in December we're going to give a Christmas hamper to all grant recipients? We are not putting that kind of pressure on retailers, but the money is going into the pockets. They are making significant amounts of money. Why can't the banking association say, you know what? No charges for December. Maybe even January, February, God may move their heart even for the next iteration. Let's hope. But why can't we begin to do things like that? Why can't we begin to be innovative and get the retailers and others who are benefiting a lot from these contracts? If you have to show you how much they are benefiting, man, you'll be shocked. You'll jump off your seat. But why is it that the poor are always made to suffer? And there's no ways and measures of bringing them in and bringing the poor into a space where they could at least also get something beyond what they normally get. 350 is nothing, ladies and gentlemen. It's absolutely nothing. I think General Moyo highlighted the importance around some of those, at least what you get for it, what you can get or what you cannot get. I particularly like what Johnny indicated at the beginning, that it's no longer the time of should we. It's the time of how best can we. And I think a common aspect that we must never forget to highlight, especially to those who handle the fiscus and those who are continue to dispel or talk against the basic income grant, is what is the impact of not acting? We have a greater impact of not acting. The risk is higher for not acting as opposed to acting. So I think that those are some of the key questions we must need to begin to ask ourselves. I must just indicate that in Section 27 of the Bill of Rights, as you may know, it establishes an overarching rights-based framework for a guarantee of access to social security. Despite this guarantee, though, the country continues to suffer from the so-called missing middle conundrum. And of course, these are adults of a working age who do not have access to any form of social assistance except when they are disabled. And I think that it's a real challenge that even though this guarantee is provided, it's not in fruition. It's not being implemented in the manner in which it ought to. You'd also recall, ladies and gentlemen, that in March, March 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. And this pandemic and consequent lockdown exacerbated the loss of hundreds of household income and increased hunger, resulting in the working poor suffering the deepest job losses, on the one hand, whilst not having access to the pre-existing social grants, which are aimed at providing support to people who are outside of the labor market. And this lower-level workers who lost their jobs had very little to fall back on, as the majority are also not covered by social insurance. We all know that poverty, inequality, and unemployment have been massive challenges before COVID-19, and even as we recover from the pre-pandemic levels, the triple challenges will still be there. It is worth noting, though, that it has become widely accepted internationally that social protection is an important element of development, including both human and economic development, and cushions vulnerable people from the severe impact of disasters. And I think the important thing is that we know that the 350 grant does not address employment challenges. That's a fact. But what it does do, it does shift poverty. It does address poverty, and it does address inequality to a large extent. There's been this argument, Prof, around, Program Director, around, but why are grant recipients, why can we not link grant recipients to economic opportunities? I think that the argument is fine, it's sound, and I think that there's some work that is beginning to manifest itself in this space. I keep asking the question that when we get these hints that there's a lot of economic activity going to take place here, for example, Ford is going to be building a massive plant in Pretoria North. What does it mean for our grant recipients? Is there no way possible that we can say, for those contracts that are based there, are we not able to shift some of the people who are on the grant recipients and be able to do it there? You know, at some point, at one stage in my life, I was in a particular country, I won't say where, and there was construction taking place on the road, Program Director. And you know, there are people, when there's construction on the road, who wave flags, the red flag, right? To show you that there's construction taking place here. You've seen that? It happens here as well. To my surprise, those people were not from that country, but they were brought in from a different country to come and wave the flag to show that there's construction here. Now that's unskilled labor. That's unskilled labor. Why can we not take people off the grant, get them a better job, at least wave the flag and do a little bit more, because you get paid much more by doing that as opposed to getting the grant itself. So there are ways and mechanisms in which I think some of the colleagues have started putting in place. We've signed an agreement with Sasol now, recently, Fanny. Again, trying to get recipients out of the grant. And, the interesting thing here is that we've got interesting data. There are people who actually have matriculated. You'll be surprised that there are people who are engineers who are on the 350 grant. But because they have no job, they're on the 350 grant, they've got nowhere else to go. Can we not take that data, that important data, and begin to link it to institutions who we know are able to provide that level of assistance in terms of employment? A significant number have also passed matric. Can we not take those, skill them, and get them into jobs? I think the ideas are there. It's just not happening fast enough. And I think that's one of the things that we need to really focus on. But let me say this, that in December 2021, you would recall that the department, in collaboration with the ILO, hosted a webinar to launch the first expert report on the appropriateness and feasibility of the basic income grant in South Africa. The second panel report, which is being dealt with today, is a supplementary modeling report building on the first report in December 2021. And those of you who were there in December last year would recall the fascinating debates we had, and the questions that were raised and the concerns that were raised by some, and so on. And I think that the expert panel report on the basic income support really provides a groundbreaking opportunity to influence the basic income support discourse in terms of building a strong case for its implementation. And this report reveals that the impact of the COVID-19 SRD grant on poverty and inequality is potentially more significant than previously understood. What I like about this report is that it also zooms into provinces and begins to give a bit of a detailed report around poverty in specific provinces. And I think that that's quite significant. And so we are very glad that we're here to do this launch of this report, which is the second report. And we must thank and appreciate our expert panel. Can we give them a hand if you could stand? Just all those who contributed to the report, if they could stand. I know they're here, but where are the others? I know there are others there. If you could just give them a hand and really appreciate what they've done with this report. Thank you very much. We appreciate your cooperation and your partnership. We also appreciate the NGOs like #PayTheGrant, because they assist in raising awareness around some of these things. The work that Isabel is doing with SPY and a number of others that I may not mention. We really appreciate your input and your partnership as well. We're confident that we will get to that end goal and that dream and that vision that was had many years ago when Prof. Taylor first started this work. We are very confident that we'll get to that. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you and appreciate you for being here, and we look forward to the rest of this session. And I want to encourage those who still have question marks in their heads, read the report. Get the report, the facts are there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. Mkunu. So this part of the program is going to get straight into this report. Of course, we've been talking about the report the whole morning. But we don't actually really know what is in this report, right? And what it has found this time around as it builds on the work done last year. Professor Alex van der Heever is an adjunct professor who holds the chair of Social Security Systems Administration and Management Studies at Wits University. In particular, it's the School of Governance, and he's worked in areas of health economics, public finance, and social security since 1989. And he worked for the Department of Finance, Industrial Development Corporation, and Center for Health Policy, and various other departments. He's got a wealth of experience. And of course, he's also been part of the team that has made decisions around the modeling of this report. How exactly is this research going to be undertaken, and then the final result of the research? Prof, the floor is yours to, number one, tell us how you went about conducting this work, and then, of course, most importantly, what your findings have been.
Thank you. Shall I stand up there?
Yes, you may, absolutely.
Thank you. Good morning, and good morning also to the Minister and the Acting Director General and the ILO, who are very much part of supporting this process. What I'm going to do is run through the idea, the key questions that we needed to address with this analysis and why we were doing it, and also to look at some of the key results. It won't be possible to go through every single detailed result or to explain it fully. So we do have the panel discussions where these will be engaged on a little bit more. I would encourage people to read the report as well, for those who want to actually have a look at the detailed evidence. It's important to note that this report needs to be seen together with the last report. It builds on it. So in essence, you need to read both together, because in the first report, quite a lot of it provided empirical analysis and a situation analysis of the South African context. That's not done in the second report. The second report continues a modeling exercise in which we went into a lot more depth on specific issues to get a better handle on them. And I'll go into that a bit more. Just want to see how it does work. So in terms of an overview, the modeling team, it was narrowed down this time round to just dealing with people who are focused on modeling analysis. So I chaired the panel. It was Professor Margaret Chitiga-Mabuga, who's the Dean of Economics and Management Sciences at Pretoria University. And it was her modeling team that did the analysis for the first report. But we changed models because we wanted to have a model that could examine and analyze issues at a provincial level, which I'll go into in more depth. And also we needed a sort of modified tax function, sort of public government function, which could be done with the second report. Professor Jan van Heerden, who's here today, is a professor of economics at the University of Pretoria as well. And it's his modeling analysis, his modeling model and analysis, which we focused on in this report. Jan was part of last year's process as well. So what we actually did was, where it was Margaret, because it would allow us to do a lot more sort of detailed analyses of impacts on household incomes and sectoral results, and also added to that provincial analysis, which wouldn't be possible with any of the macro models in existence. But there are limitations, which we would talk to and discuss. But the microsimulation models have historically often been used as the primary tool to examine the impact of social grants. And the problem with that is that they tend to just emphasize the cost side and can't give a complete picture of the benefit side of the grants. They give what we often refer to in this analysis as a first-order impact. We just know immediate distributional impacts, but we don't know what happens on an ongoing basis. We don't know what happens when we look at the full distributional impacts, which we can only get from an economic model. So we're using both, and we're using them for what they do best. And we will show there are differences in the results that we get from the microsimulation, for instance, on income inequality and poverty, because they can't do the analysis that can be done in the CGE models, the economic models. So this is the second analysis of what's called a basic system of income support for income-compromised adults in South Africa. It's important to note that we've got a set of grants that we have in South Africa, all of them providing some kind of income support. Historically, the way it's been framed is very much, if you had to kind of, this idea of the notion of the deserving poor is that our grants have largely been concentrated on what people regard as the deserving poor, essentially people who are in circumstances which they can't control, and therefore there's some legitimacy to allocating them an income and support. So somebody who's disabled, a child in an income-compromised family, somebody in old age where they don't have people, adults, etc., seen as people who should just go out and work and get a job, and that's how they should get their income. And that security perspective, countries in the world accept that you do incomes through labor, through work. And so this notion is analysis in this gap that we've had in the past is that we've never in some kind of moral degradation of the population. So we examined the economic and the sort of the social and economic implications, which we tried to do to capture both elements. So I was part of the Taylor Committee of Inquiry, as was Brenda, which I think Selwyn forgot. Brenda was also part of the, Sebeka was part of the Taylor Committee of Inquiry. It was something we couldn't do completely in 2000 and 2002, was to actually do both the economic evaluation properly as well as the social impacts very effectively. And I think that limited, that allowed a gap to exist in what people understood about the impacts, which allowed people to say, well, we just don't know. People who are cautious about the fiscal position of government and how the economy, their understanding of how the economy operates, would then say, well, because we don't know, we can't take a risk. So the purpose was therefore to understand the economic, fiscal, and social outcomes of a standard version of income support. So it's important to note that this analysis wasn't done of a basic income grant, a universal basic income grant. It focused specifically on the social relief of distress grant. And the reason for doing that is that, in essence, as has been indicated by the acting DG, is that there is still a position that this is a temporary grant, that it'll be taken away and maybe replaced with something that is less burdensome, so that people can put it into some other kind of program, money into other kinds of programs. So it's important to actually understand, well, what is the impact of the social relief of distress grant, just focusing on it as an important policy intervention on its own. So the key features of this are as has been pointed out, it's the money that's being allocated to people from the ages of 18 to 59, the historical gap, and the two models were used. And the results have indicated that to implement a grant of this nature, economic growth can be, this is from the first report, this is the kind of conclusion that came out of it, was that economic growth can be protected and the fiscal position of government can be protected while achieving the social results that come from the grant. So that, in fact, this grant would be counterproductive from an economic perspective is an important issue to understand. It's important also to understand that a part of this analysis wasn't to demonstrate that we would get positive economic growth out of the grant. We, in fact, sterilize the whole impact of the grant from a growth perspective. We want to see that we don't have a negative effect. We don't necessarily trying to achieve support. So it was also argued that to minimize the behavioral impacts on the tax system, that a larger grant should be phased in over time. So there is an issue that even if there is a positive economic effect that you can get when you try and finance a very large version of an income grant very rapidly, the introduction of new taxes poses behavioral risks on the tax system that are not easy to model. And therefore, one can be reasonably conservative about phasing. But the idea really is that there should be a continuous progressive enhancement of the grant, which can be carefully of the continuous reassessment of the PI with inflation, but that they are positively improved over time, incrementally in a way that does not pose fiscal risks on the country and other economic risks. And we felt that we could demonstrate that. So an entry-level version of the grant should therefore be considered at the lower bound poverty level. That was the conclusion of the first report, and that there should be incremental enhancement. It's worthwhile noting that the COVID SRD grant was introduced at 350 Rand in 2020, and it's still at 350 Rand. So it hasn't even been increased by inflation, and the means test was, two ways of understanding the word means. There's mean and means. The means test has been particularly mean over the past few years. Initially, a very, very low value, no income was the requirement, and now a very, very low means test and an burdensome administrative process that has hindered people's access to the grant. So this does need to be thought of very carefully. So as the initial report focused on the strategic outcomes of a large version of a basic income support system, it didn't examine the detail of medium-term options on the stabilization of the SRD grant, together with adjustments to keep pace with inflation. So this iteration of the panel therefore focused exclusively on the SRD grant as implemented to understand the economic, fiscal, and social implications of making it permanent. So it really was looking at a kind of cost-benefit analysis of the grant as it exists. So the focus of the analysis, what we actually focused on in terms of policy scenarios, did involve something different from what we had done, in that we also introduced a component that wasn't a social grant to analyze. So the first is the COVID SRD grant, and we examined alternative financing options, different ways of funding it. So it's important to note that in the way that we analyzed this, we assumed that the grant was entirely unfunded. In other words, that it would have to be funded. Now, that's not the reality, the practical reality we face. The grant is being paid for today out of general taxes. So there's a tax regime. It's not being funded out of deficit funding. It's essentially it has been possible to fit this grant into the existing fiscal framework without having to raise the entire amount with a new tax. However, we assume that we do have to raise an entirely new tax to fund the grant as it exists in order to get the net benefits, the net positives and negatives out of that. But it also was very useful to do an analysis of what different types of tax might have as an impact on both economic growth and sort of economic output, employment, and the distributional effects themselves of this. So we had options in which we would look at whether or not we would emphasize value-added tax as the funding mechanism, the primary funding mechanism, personal income tax. These two taxes are quite different in terms of what we were trying to look at. So these are the kind of research questions that we're asking. So the social grants are government transfers to households, which effectively reflect a redistribution of income from high-income households to low-income households. So this question that's often asked, where does the money come from? The money comes from high-income households. It's a system of transfers in which you're taxing some and you is what are the positive and negative effects of essentially changing the structure. So if you had to introduce this, a non-neutral effect from a tax perspective would come in if you suddenly had to finance everything or another kind of tax or a corporate tax. And in doing so, you will have behavioral effects. And the behavioral effects are people start to avoid paying taxes. So you have to be aware of those. We're not examining the behavioral impacts in this analysis. We're assuming that people are going to continue with their historical behavior that they've done in paying current taxes, on the assumption that largely this is already funded within the current fiscal framework. So the redistributive nature of such grants raises concerns about the impact they may have on economic growth and possible incentive effects on who must pay for the grant. Consistent with such concerns are policy prescriptions that argue for growth strategies to be prioritized that directly address unemployment as the central lever to alleviate poverty and income inequality. So there's this idea that, in fact, this type of allocation and this kind of intervention is an inefficient adjustment. In fact, it would be more productive for government to focus on directly creating employment. And by doing so, and if it triggered growth and it got economic output up, that would be the primary mechanism by which poverty and inequality would be alleviated. So that is a particular issue. And why that's stated there is that because that has really been the predominant argument since 2000 in relation to any system of income transfers. So such approaches keep redistributive strategies, such as social grants. If you adopt that view, they keep them to a minimum until such time as growth has provided fiscal space for greater social generosity. So conversely, it can be argued, however, that social grants up to an optimal threshold yield positive economic and social outcomes. So that's the alternative thesis. And in this view, suboptimal transfers below such a threshold systematically it is downward, resulting in structural unemployment, permanent strata of extreme poverty, and structural income inequality. It's important to note that there are limits to what we can model around these issues. We can model certain of these issues, but we can't, in many cases, many of the dynamics about how people change their life paths and participate creatively in society can't be modeled easily. But that is part of the issue, is that in fact, if you create this huge distortion in society, that in fact you create a permanent burden on the ability of the country to evolve productively. So these are the two views. One says we will grow productively if we allow essentially income and wealth to be concentrated, and the other says better distributed. So if these two views are essentially been the key challenges behind these discussions, recognize that. So South Africa may be classed as a small open economy, and that may limit certain of the opportunities for sort of competitive expansion, let's say, of manufactured products for both domestic and international consumption. Whereas it might be different in a country such as Brazil or India, which are much larger, and where if you stimulated or you redistributed income, the impact might be different to South Africa, whereas a lot of our growth might be dissipated through imports, for instance. So what appears settled in international research is that positive redistribution is necessary to address systemic distributional failures of all market economies. And so, for instance, a country such as Sweden would approach South Africa's levels of poverty and inequality today if it didn't actually have its system of social protection in place. So that would apply to France, to Germany, to all OECD countries, that in fact their pre-tax levels of redistribution look like us and would progress and create a de facto distribution of income going forward. So these are important debates that have to be resolved. So the key questions, the question therefore is not whether there is a trade-off between growth and redistribution, but rather whether it is properly understood how to progressively deepen redistribution in a sustainable way that is sensitive to the domestic context. It's a way of framing the question. It also doesn't pay to assume you could just massively redistribute overnight. You want to do it in a manner that is sustainable and generates the kind of results that you need over time. So the primary question before this iteration of the expert panel, therefore, is whether it is possible to implement income redistribution in the form of the SRD grant on a permanent basis in such a manner that economic growth and public finances are protected. So that becomes the limit. Can we protect those while we achieve a redistributive effect? So in addressing the primary question, the following additional questions also need to be considered. So assuming a balanced budget approach to financing the transfers, the question is what's the optimal mix of financing options? So that we examine VAT versus personal income tax as the methods of financing. How are poverty and inequality affected by the transfers, both nationally and provincially? And what are the effects by economic sector of the transfers, both nationally and provincially? And are the outcomes of the SRD grant likely to be replicated for real improvements in the benefit value and eligibility criteria? You'd want to be able to extrapolate from what you find about the SRD grant and assume that it would apply to an improvement. How do government-funded employment strategies compare to social transfers? So we looked at a wage subsidy as our key alternative employment generation intervention. And what happens when we combine a strategy of income transfers with an employment strategy? So we model all of those. The models I've pointed out, it's a microsimulation and a computable general equilibrium model. The computable general equilibrium model is described in the first report, and it's also the key assumptions and frameworks and differences from the first report are reported in the second report. I won't go into it in too much detail, but for those of you who've done a little bit of economics, the issue is that this is essentially a microeconomic model and allows us to do certain kinds of analyses that, for instance, a macro model wouldn't be able to do. So I won't go into any more detail, but it's an economic model that gives us quite a lot of disaggregated results for the South African economy. So in this iteration, and we also use the microsimulation model. So the differences from the first iteration is the microsimulation model has been updated to allow for sort of more discrete tax options to be examined from the microsimulation perspective. And the CGE model can examine a more disaggregated breakdown of households by income and provide results by province. So a health warning. This is the health warning from the first report. It's important to note that the use of models for policy analysis comes with a health warning. Economic models only provide broad indicators how aspects of the economy may react to policy designs and are as good as the model designs and assumptions. They cannot be used as projections or even firm indications of a holistic economic response. We have to add additional knowledge and information over it that cannot be accurately modeled, may qualify model results. So that's important. This is a support to the intellectual process of a sort of structured way of examining a policy. And it's worthwhile noting that this kind of modeling exercise hasn't really been used to examine policy in South Africa, and it should be. I was part of, worked on early versions of the CGE model when it was first brought to South Africa in sort of vision of the model since that period. And what's been missing in a lot of policy analysis in South Africa and how we even thought about why we would even use this kind of CGE model in 1993 was that it helps to stop stupid conversations. It's sort of simple. Stop stupid conversations. It means you're forced to say, well, if that's your assumption, you're asking for, 600 billion rand. We can't give you that. So we're looking at 13.1, which is a conservative estimate of the number of potential beneficiaries, and we used that as the basis to determine the impact. Came to roughly 50 billion rand as an outlay. It's worthwhile noting that the budget allocation for this year was 44 billion rand. There was, I don't know what informed the 44 billion rand that provided that allocation, because it potentially wasn't consistent with the number of true beneficiaries that would arise even with this analysis. Creating, I think, some problems with how people would then try and limit beneficiaries when they have an entitlement that is given to them by law. You shouldn't do that. That is bad government. So, but I think that part of the analysis going forward is that there must be, if you don't like the amount of money you're allocating, then adjust the policy. But don't have one policy and then try and limit it using unfair means. So the distribution of that allocation by households is given at the bottom in that table. So that gives you by decile. So those are how it actually gets allocated to the different households as a shock. I won't go into that in too much depth, but in essence, the distributional effects of the grant are quantified within the microsimulation model and then used as the input factors, input variables in the CGE model to show the impact of the grant. So the simulations, I'm going to quickly go through these, and I know that there's a problem with how long it might be to give everybody the full detail of the report, but I'll try and go very fast through the key issues just to give a sort of a heads up on the key issues. But we did 4 basic simulations. The simulation 1 is that the SRD grant outlay of 50 billion rand is financed primarily using an increase in VAT in the early years of the simulation. So there the dominant financing mechanism is value-added tax. The second simulation is exactly the same grant value, but here is funded through personal income tax on the top 3 deciles. The highest 3, top 30% of incomes households. Simulation 3 is a wage subsidy. It's important to note that the wage subsidy we've proposed, there is a wage subsidy that exists at the moment, so-called ETI, or given by government to an employment tax incentive. It's not a very well-targeted tax, in my view, and it's very unclear who it goes to at the end of the day. In this modeling analysis, we limit who it goes to. It's allocated to the bottom 4 occupational groups: domestic workers, elementary workers, operators, and skilled agricultural workers. So those are the only recipients of the wage subsidy. And they're given to show us a side-by-side analysis. The value of that wage subsidy is 50 billion rand as well. That's nowhere near to what the current ETI stands at. But we're not modeling the ETI, but we are wanting to see the differential effects. And then simulation 4 is where we take the SRD grant outlay of 50 billion combined with the personal income tax as a financing mechanism, but because by the time we looked at these scenarios, we had already done some simulations, and the personal income tax financing mechanism was largely the optimal method of financing. And so in both CGE Sum 3, the wage subsidy, and Sum 4, we use personal income tax as the key financing mechanism. But in this one, we allocate the grant of 50 billion, and we make the wage subsidy 25 billion rand. So we're combining them two. It's a bit like eating meat and cabbages. Let's see what the overall outcome is. So in terms of the results, in social incomes, we produce, what was interesting was that historically the poverty level outcomes and the inequality outcomes had only been analyzed using a microsimulation model. But in this analysis, what we did was we used the CGE model to analyze the poverty impact. So we had a more complete assessment of the full impact of the grants, which you won't get in a microsimulation model. And so when you compare what a microsimulation model result gives to the CGE model, there's a difference. And in fact, the CGE model is showing a more pronounced effect from the grant than you'd get in a microsimulation model. And that's important because all we've been looking at historically are microsimulation model outputs. This is by province, and it's worthwhile just seeing that there's quite big differences by province in the baseline poverty level. So this is at the lower bound poverty level. These percentages are the percentage of people in poverty. And what you've seen is for the different simulations, the different outcomes you get. So for instance, if we look at Limpopo at the top, their baseline poverty level is 42.8%. And simulation 1, which is predominantly VAT financed, it drops it to 38.4%. But simulation 2, which drops to 37.1%, so there's a difference. Simulation 3, which is the wage subsidy, doesn't have as profound an effect on poverty as does the social grants. And it drops to 39.5%. And simulation 4, which is the combined wage subsidy and SRD grant, you get the poverty level drops to 37.1%. So in fact, it comes out at other provinces, their baselines are quite different. So if we look at Gauteng, it starts at 23%. So it's way better as a starting point than other provinces. And it's important to note that provinces like Gauteng and the Western Cape experience around about 20 to 25% population growth over a 20-year period. And yet, despite that, they have a much lower poverty level than the rest of the country. So the Gauteng goes from 23% down to sort of 20.7 for simulation 1, 19% for simulation 2. These are big drops. And 19% in simulation 4. But interestingly, 20.8% for simulation 3. So the wage subsidy doesn't quite get the same impact on poverty, but it does have an impact. And it's important that is funded by personal income tax, so there is a redistributional element to the wage subsidy that's very important to specific occupational groups. Okay. So anyway, so you can look at those numbers. This just shows you what the differentials are, what the movements were in terms of low-bound poverty levels. At the national level, a 15.3% reduction in poverty on these grounds. But provinces like Free State, a 21.7% reduction. KwaZulu-Natal, 18.8% reduction. So big. If we have to look at Gini coefficients, again I pointed out, Gini coefficients using microsimulation do not produce this result. They produce a weaker result. And so here you've got quite significant reductions and differences between whether or not it's VAT or personal income tax that's financed. So I'll leave that for people to go through in more detail, but these are quite significant, and I'll just give you the percentage movements in Gini coefficients. So Gini coefficients, for everybody, I'm assuming everybody knows what a Gini coefficient is, but essentially what it is the closer you are to 1, the more unequal the society, the closer you are to 0, the more equal. So if we had to look at this, you see we're at 0.62 at Limpopo at the beginning. It drops to 0.59 in simulation 2. So it's quite a big reduction. And if we had to look at what happens with disposable incomes, if we had to look at the national level, so we're looking at simulation 1 there, you can see, so it's basically the distribution of income. The top deciles are toward this end. So see your highest income groups, your lowest income groups for all of these. So what you're seeing is that basically this is redistributional. It takes money from richer people, gives it to poorer people. So simulation 1 shows a very substantial redistributive effect. This is just the COVID SRD grant, by the way, not any other fancy grant. Simulation 2, so simulation 1 is VAT financed, simulation 2 is personal income tax financed. What's interesting here is that the wage subsidy doesn't generate as big a distributional impact. There is redistribution, but it's not as powerful as the social grant. And the combined effect is very powerful, but obviously that's 75 billion rand as opposed to 50 billion rand. So note that distortion. This is the disposable income variations, the baseline by province for the different simulations. And it shows that there are big differences between these. So simulation 1, this is PIT financed, the orange. And you can see the difference between the orange and the blue, which is VAT versus personal income tax finance for the same grant. There's a difference. That is important because if there's a difference, it means you have to think very carefully about whether or not you increase VAT in order to finance the grant. So conclusions on this. So just to point out that the reason for the VAT impact we found with the modeling analysis was that the model is largely driven on price impacts on the economy. So VAT operates through changing prices within the system. And that's where a part of the impact comes through. So it has a depressive effect on economic output. And that in itself then has a knock-on effect on other factors in the economy, whereas personal income tax doesn't and is very directly redistributional. So on the social outcomes, there's reduced poverty on inequality outcomes for the 4 simulations with the weakest results for the wage subsidy simulation. Of the standalone SRD grants, the CGE SIM 2, the personal income tax finance grant, outperforms the VAT finance version. The simulation 4 outcomes are strongly redistributive, but not significantly different to simulation 2, the PIT, so from a social perspective. And then the SRD grant also has important interprovincial redistributive effects with a material narrowing of the interprovincial Gini coefficient differentials around a national lower result of 0.61 for the Gini coefficient result. And very quickly, because I've got a minute to go through the economic outcomes. So it's difficult to go through this in rapid detail because there's a lot to talk about and there will be a full panel on this. But in essence, there are very big differences in the overall outcome on economic output, depending on the financing arrangements. So you'll see the orange bar is the simulation 1, the VAT finance version of the grant, versus CGE SIM 2, the sort of magenta, which is slightly positive, not hugely positive. It doesn't create a negative result. But the CGE SIM 1 generates a negative output result. So across a number of the economic variables there. So I'm not going to go into those in too much detail. If we have to look at the sort of national output outcomes, sort of GDP outcomes by for these different variations by simulation, you can see that in fact the most powerful positive effect comes from the wage subsidy. So the wage subsidy has a very strong economic output, but it doesn't have the same distributional impacts. And that's one of the reasons also why looking at simulation 4, which combines the two, actually kind of, it's when you combine the vegetables with your proteins, you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. Simulation 2, this is just by province. The variations from the baseline for GDP for 2022 all the way to 2045. And you can see that there are differences over time as certain variables converge. That will be discussed more in the economic panel. And this is simulation 4, which shows overall positive results for both. So it does make sense to potentially combine a coherent employment strategy with a wage subsidy as a policy going forward, as a supplement. So I'm kind of out of time, but we've got specific results on the sectoral level. And all I'll do is just state what this is telling us. This is telling us that there's a shift from services to manufacturing from the SRD grant on the whole. And whereas in the case of the wage subsidy, there's also that shift, but a generally positive economic output shift. But the output shift that occurs for the wage subsidy is away from services and toward manufacturing, which is positive. Manufacturing is where you generate a lot of job growth. I won't discuss the employment effects that can come through. It's very much a modeling outcome, but the strongest employment effect was in the wage subsidy. But the blue line is the combined wage subsidy social grant. And in the case of the simulation 2, the PIT finance version of the grant, it basically is neutral in terms of its overall effect, in terms of variation from the baseline. So essentially it doesn't harm growth, but these models are not good at essentially analyzing employment effects over time. So we've analyzed what we can. So findings, in terms of inclusive growth, the SRD grant offers significant redistributive opportunities, diminished only by the choice of financing options. And where PIT, personal income tax, rather than VAT is used, economic output deviates positively from the baseline while also achieving material positive distributional outcomes. And then inclusive growth options appear very strong when the SRD grant is combined with a wage subsidy that targets the lowest occupational groups. In practice, the achievement of a well-targeted wage subsidy scheme may prove difficult, which is an important issue. It's how do you actually design it that the money doesn't end up going to me and goes to the people who should get it. In terms of financing, negative outcomes result from the use of VAT, which suggests one should be incredibly careful about using VAT increases until there's more information on the dynamics around VAT adjustments. So given South Africa's extreme income inequality, revenue-raising options for new program should make the use of progressive taxes as far as possible. The viability of the SRD grant, the modeling results show that depending on how it is financed, the SRD grant can be introduced in a manner which is fiscally and economically sustainable, while at the same time having a material impact on poverty and inequality. And it also shows that, so this, and I've pointed out the issues about the assumptions on the tax financing, so the balanced budget approach. Employment strategies, a wage subsidy targeted at the lowest groups, shows promise. While the interventions, when the interventions are combined, there are potential gains for both economic output and poverty and inequality. And I've commented on those, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that, Prof. van der Heever. Quite extensive research that you have done, and I think a lot for us to unpack and to try and make sense of, because modeling can be quite difficult to interpret, especially for somebody like me who failed Economics 101. So
It's how it was taught.
So I look at the graphs and they're bringing back really, really bad memories of what I didn't allow myself to go through for the rest of my time in varsity. Let me invite Ms. Yuri Ramkesoon, who is with the South African Human Rights Commission, who's going to be part of this panel discussion. Yuri, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Also joining us is Dr. Kelly Housen, who's with the Institute for Economic Justice, but is joining us virtually. Kelly, good morning. All right, we just need to get Kelly connected to the main sound system because I'm not hearing her clearly. Yuri, I'll give you an opportunity just to give us your responding remarks to this research. If you can keep it as brief as possible, because we still have the opportunity of getting questions and comments from the floor that I would want us to also make time for. So for all of the delegates that are part of the session this morning, I will be giving you an opportunity shortly to ask specific questions to the panelists and to Professor van der Heever. We will have a roving microphone, so just if you can prepare those in the meantime. But Yuri, let me give you an opportunity to kick us off.
Thanks. So firstly, I think it's important to note that this research is extremely critical and it's just expertly researched. And I think it provides invaluable simulations that show how we can make a basic income grant or a BIS a reality and move how others have been speaking to from theory to actual implementation. So from the Human Rights Commission's perspective, we've always supported a basic income grant. And that's based on many factors, but including the fact that of all the complaints that we receive annually at the Human Rights Commission, a lack of access to basic services is always second on our radar, following equality complaints in terms of race. And we receive thousands and thousands of complaints on a lack of access to services. And these are always, rooted in poverty and inequality. Also, it was recommended by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the UN Committee, that South Africa is actually in need of a basic income grant because of our staggering levels of poverty and inequality. So again, I can't express enough how important this research is. And the report also notes that economic growth does not lead to employment. So we need, other interventions to ensure that we are dealing with poverty and inequality. I was really interested in the interprovincial analysis because at the Commission, our reports show that there's huge discrepancies in poverty and equality between provinces, and not just poverty, but multidimensional poverty, which is extremely stubborn and invasive. And we also see that trying to make shifts in poverty in these provinces is extremely difficult, and it follows patterns of spatial apartheid geography, which we've not been able to shift in 25 years. I think it's also important to note that, the reality of the situation, as Colonel Moyo spoke about, is that at the end of the day, we speak about models and we speak about statistics, but 1 in 4 people goes to bed hungry every night. And that's the South African reality. And what we found during the pandemic, riots, flooding, is that even though we have the child support grant, the children might be fed, but their parents are going to bed hungry. We also found that even when we had the social relief of distress grant, those mothers whose children were receiving the child support grant were not legible to receive the social relief of distress grant, which was quite appalling, and it's something, we've been working on. So, the child support grant is not enough to feed families. It helps that child go to school and that child be fed. The cost of not doing something. And I think that's an extremely important point, and one that, the models don't really take into account, and it's difficult. What is the impact on our economy of doing nothing? What will be the impact on education? What will be the impact on health? What will be the burden on our public healthcare system if we do nothing? One that will not just show the impact of all our poverty alleviation strategies moving forward, but also one that we can look at and say, well, this is what a family is spending per month on their basic needs, and this is how much they need to survive, and this is what the state needs to provide to them and how we need to provide it. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Yuri. Dr. Kelly, I'm going to come to you and also give you then an opportunity just to give us your response to the findings that have been released here by Dr. van der Heever.
The panel, sorry, I'm just getting a bit of info and I can't. I don't ignore the echo. I also wanted to reiterate the point made that this is an incredibly important report, an incredibly important modelling exercise. There's a strong need for these kinds of models and this kind of data to support what the research that organisations like IEJ and SPI have been doing, and also to support the calls that have been made from organisations like Pay the Grants and activists like General Moyo, who have been putting forward many of these arguments for the need for expanded social protection in South Africa, the on-the-ground impacts of that social protection. So we really welcome this important research to show the bigger picture about the economic and the social impacts of the SRD grant and of basic income support in the future. A lot of what has been highlighted in this report is very consistent and aligned with what the Institute for Economic Justice has been arguing and proposing over the past couple of years. And I think that a couple of important kind of points to mention are the differences in the funding mechanisms in terms of the social outcomes of the SRD grant and other forms of social protection. We have also argued that regressive forms of taxation such as VAT can serve to undermine some of the positive impacts of some of the positive distributional impacts of the SRD grant and other forms of social protection. And so we're encouraged to see the report highlighting the fact that progressive forms of financing can really support the outcomes in terms of inclusive growth, in terms of poverty and inequality reduction. In the research that we've done over the past year, we've also taken a broader look at the social impacts of a basic income grant, and in particular a universal basic income grant, which the IEJ and a number of our partner organizations in this space hold up and advocate for as the ideal kind of goal or objective in terms of expanding social protection. And so the poverty and inequality reducing impacts of these grants are, the clear and very well evidenced social outcomes of big. But there are other long-term social impacts that I think that it's important to dig down into and highlight, and that our research has highlighted. And these include impacts on gender inequality, as well as health, mental health, access to education, and things like social cohesion. And I think that it's just important to show within this debate that social protection spending in the form of grants has these flow-on effects, these social impacts that go beyond dealing with our immediate crisis of hunger and exclusion towards addressing some of the other entrenched social challenges that we face. So, for instance, we experience internationally from cash transfer initiatives has shown that they can have a positive impact on improving women's independence and agency, and in turn, reducing women's vulnerability to gender-based violence. If grants are paid to all adults, to all individuals, that improves women's life choices and makes them less dependent on male partners, and in turn, it can reduce their vulnerability to gender-based violence. In addition, there's a wealth of international evidence that shows that unconditional cash transfers, such as the SRD grant, can improve people's health outcomes and can help to disrupt the intergenerational cycle of poverty and poor health, as well as improving people's mental health. So impacts like this are highlighted in our research and really complement the findings of this report to show those flow-on effects of reducing poverty and inequality. In turn, there's an enormous body of international evidence out there, as has been touched on by other speakers, which shows that social protection spending is not a policy trade-off with employment spending, with programs that target job creation as well as economic growth. Social protection spending can support economic growth, and those impacts are particularly concentrated and seen in more marginalized and depressed areas. And I think it's worth briefly digging down into why that is. What are some of the barriers to people accessing employment, accessing economic activities and participation in their communities? And one of the biggest barriers is simply poverty. So there's research out there that shows that the SRD grant has enabled young job seekers to access job markets, to go out and apply for jobs, to catch transport, to print their CVs, and that this has been how the SRD grant, as low as it is, has actually been used in communities. So I'll stop there. But thank you again to the panel, to the Minister and to the Acting Director General for launching this important report today.
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Kelly. And of course, you are still going to be staying with us online as we get into this panel discussion. Delegates, I'm also mindful of the time and the fact that we are running a little bit behind schedule. So I'll go straight then to the questions that are coming through from the floor for the panelists, in as far as points of clarity, contributions, comments to this report that has been launched. Please do not make me pick on you, because I might expose the fact that you too maybe failed Economics 101. So just by way of raising your hand, questions, comments, and if you can be specific about who you're directing it to, or if you just want any of the panelists to take it up. All right, I see. I think the mic is closer to the right side of the room. We'll begin this side and come over this way. And please keep it short and sweet for me.
Good morning. Thanks, Alex, for your presentation. One question is, in your paper, you indicate that the BIS should be set at a minimum of the lower bound poverty level and then increase over time from there. But in your modeling, you model at 350 Rand. So I want to know why.
Thanks for that question. Prof, you can go for it.
The last report, the first report, we actually did the impact analysis with the larger grant version. And what we were really trying to assess with the COVID SRD grant, with that value, is using that as a kind of a case study for the economic and social impacts. If we had to double the value or triple the value, we would largely be looking at a kind of a linear extrapolation of what we're seeing with this grant. So this is really telling us what would happen with a larger version as well. Note that we're not able to analyze the negative implications of things like means tests and so on and how they apply. What we are doing is focusing on the sort of economic and distributional impact. And the reason for that is really to allow that debate to get more coherent, because that's essentially the point of argument against these. That's the reason why government for 20 to 30 years has said we're going to prioritize other things. So that's why we're answering that question. So the lower bound poverty level, if the recommendations go that actually, if this is the consequence and we can incrementally improve these grants over time in an economically and fiscally sustainable way, we should progress all the way up to the upper bound poverty level. So that in essence, we have no income poverty in South Africa as our objective, consistent with Section 27. We're not saying we do that overnight, because that won't produce the same results as the model analysis. But what we would be arguing is that we would say an incremental improvement is safe.
Thanks for that. Yes, ma'am. And just a reminder, if you can please name and surname and organization that you're from.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bella. I'm from #PayTheGrant. I also didn't like economics, professor, but I would like to welcome the report that you have just tabled and the well-researched that you put in. And we hope it will help in speeding up the implementation of this universal basic income, because communities are in dire situation and they have lost hope in our government. So I hope the report will help assist us. Thank you very much.
All right.
Good day, everyone. My name is Zentle Kyukwe and I'm from Amandla.mobi. I just wanted to, I know the professor did mention something that this would basically be about taking money from households that are wealthier to those and taking it to households that are less wealthier, so to speak. And I just wanted to know his views on the wealth tax that was brought into debates as of late, especially during the COVID pandemic, that South Africa was ripe. What does he say to studies that make those claims? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for that. And perhaps even just to add on it, Prof, so you have the wealth tax that she's talking about, but of course your modeling is also based on a personal income tax. And when we look at those in the lower regions that would be contributing to a system of this nature, in the context of South Africa, if you earn 20,000 Rand, you're middle class, you know, and so who are we talking about when we're looking at the group that falls under the personal income tax that would help to finance this?
Okay, yeah, so just to note that a wealth tax has a different distributional impact to an income tax because wealth is more concentrated. But wealth is also more difficult to tax. So the problem comes in really the design of the tax adjustment. what we're really looking at is the principle of the redistributive component. So really the top end of the tax structure is being required to pay more. But it's also talking about the principle. When somebody says, how do we pay for this? The simple answer is higher income households are paying for it. That's basically the way it works. It's not that government is suddenly having to suck money out of its thumb. It's essentially redistributive. It's changing who consumes that money. So that's, but in terms of the middle income groups that are, I mean, we are highly unequal in South Africa. And the income in the sort of the top decile, the sort of the average income in the top decile is much higher than the next decile. But the problem is that even in the top decile, there's massive inequality. So the people at the bottom end of the top decile are earning way less than the people at the top end. And a large part of that difference is wealth. It's income from assets. And that is not taxed through personal income tax, which is essentially income from work. It's salaries. So we're not making a big story about the structure of the tax system other than a distributional discussion. Is that, broadly speaking, this would be where we should get the funds from. VIT, just to point out that its impact was economically negative. It wasn't just, I mean, it had a distributional, less of a positive distributional effect because it's a regressive tax. But in fact, it was significantly problematic from an economic perspective. That's in fact what was suggested by this, which is that in fact there would be economic harm to using VAT to finance a social grant. So those are important discussions to have because they also talk to whether or not we should be using VAT to finance a deficit. Yeah. We should be very, very cautious if we're seeing these results. But what we're saying is we're not absolutely secure in the result. But what this would say is be very, very cautious for a VAT increase. Examine it more, understand the dynamics more, because it doesn't look right.
Of course, what it would also need is an amount of buy-in from South Africans who fall within that bracket that would have to contribute personal income tax potentially, that would be able to fund this grant. And again, we know that whenever you bring up the issue of tax, you are moving from just trying to solve a problem to also creating a political hot potato.
If you're raising new money, so remember in this we're doing a zero-based kind of costing assessment. We're assuming we're financing the whole thing from the start. In reality, the SRD was introduced in 2020, financed out of general taxes. It did not have a deleterious effect on the economy or on the fiscus. And in fact, it hasn't had this year with its continuation. But in essence, what's happened is it's slotted into the current governance framework. But we're saying we want to know the true effect of this grant if financed in this way. In reality, it would be an incremental adjustment. And from now onward, any improvement in it would be an incremental adjustment, not a shock to the system, and not one that actually required an increase in tax rates. So this trade-off between tax rates and this grant is not necessarily what this analysis is talking to. It's saying, it's actually a discussion on the general structure of the tax system that's optimal.
All right. Let me come to the left side of the room. There was a question. Yes, sir, in the white polo neck. Where is the microphone? Oh, it's already in your hands. Great.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon. My name is Katlego Lerodi. I'm from the SABC. I wanted to find out from just the panelists there in terms of what the concerns were raised, the concerns that were raised by Ntate Moyo and others as well, to say that the 350 that we are speaking about here is not equivalent to the economy. It's not practical. It's not in line with the needs of those that are receiving it. It's just not enough. So if we are advocating that indeed this should be solidified and be a permanent feature going forward for the country, then what are those considerations looking at the concerns that were raised from those people or by those people that are receiving the grant? And I'm glad that, Kathy, you touched on the wealth tax as well, because I wanted to just get a distinction in terms of how is this going to be rolled out in a way that it doesn't in any way victimize the wealthy, those that are really, they have the haves in terms of the monies and the likes. So how are we going to balance the act to ensure that it doesn't come back to the department to say that you're victimizing further other people by trying to accommodate others here? And also I wanted to find out about just this process. This was a supplementary, I guess, report from the first report that was raised here. Is this the final report? Is this the end of it? What was the mandate by the department? And after this, will we be seeing this report handed over to government so that they can work on changing those policies going forward? And practically, looking at the work that you've done, when can we expect to see the basic income grant coming into effect right here in South Africa? Thank you.
All right. Thanks for that, Katlego. Anybody else on the side of the room? All right. I'll give you a chance to go, Prof, and then I'll come to you, Yuri, and we'll wrap it up with Dr. Kelly.
Yeah, so the 350, the value is clearly inadequate, and there's been no CPI adjustment from 2020. So this analysis isn't questioning that fact. It's basically saying, would it be safe to improve on this over time? What are the effects? So it's not accepting 350 as appropriate. It's basically saying any redistributive program of this nature, what is the type of effect that we have, and is it dangerous for South Africa? Does it harm the fiscus? Does it harm the economy? Does it have positive outcomes? The results suggest that it has positive outcomes, suggesting that it is safe to progressively improve this. And then we have to address the issues of adequacy of support, because the alternative that has been proposed, and why this analysis has effectively been necessary, was people are arguing for 0 rands. They're arguing to go to nothing. So in essence, we would have been focusing on other things if that hadn't been the debate. So in terms of the issue of victimizing the wealthy in this doesn't, really this talks to analyzing the key questions you'd ask from a financing perspective. The optimization of the tax system will become a national treasury decision over time and how it does it. This contributes to that conversation. We're saying at this point you don't have to increase taxes to finance the SRD grant. This is just saying if we assume that it is entirely financed in this way, this is the net positive or net negative impacts. And that is advice to people who would look to financing any funding gap in this going forward. That's not necessarily there in the fiscus at the moment. Is this the final report? In essence, as I said, the reason, certainly as I understood it, for why we went for this analysis was that the grant was not made permanent, and it then focused the mind on further analysis of this grant. Plus, we had feedback from the President's Economic Advisory Council last year who said that they didn't feel that the tax analysis was adequate in the first report. We don't agree with that. We don't think that that was a coherent comment, but we did it anyway. And so there is a substantial focus on the tax issues in this report and modeling of those net impacts. And we feel that we have, and then we added in the additional dimensions that were not in the first report of the very important interprovincial effects, which are actually quite critical.
So you effectively, you're trying to create less room for the argument for why it can't happen, and even using taxes as a reason behind that.
So a large part of the critique that one tends to receive on this report is usually in narrative only. It's usually, it's never actually a technical analysis.
Yeah.
So what one does by doing this type of analysis is to essentially put the ball back in the court of somebody who disagrees, to say, right, do your technical analysis if you disagree. But it raises the bar in the conversation. And I'm afraid the bar in the conversation from 2002 has been too low.
All right, Yuri? Can we get Yuri's mic on, please? All right, I think your battery may have died.
Check it's on.
Just try again. Yeah, let's give it the roving mic.
So as Prof says, 350 is clearly not enough, but I think at the very basis, we need implementation and then a progressive realization of, what that amount is. And then in terms of, the wealthy feeling victimized or affected, we need to shift the discourse on what a basic income grant or BIS will do. There was a discourse at one stage that teenagers or younger women were falling pregnant to get the child support grant, which was clearly nonsense. And we did research on that proved that was incorrect. And we managed to, as you said, shift the bar a little bit. But we need to shift the bar on this discussion as well. Firstly, on what we lose by not implementing it, but what we gain by implementing it. It was actually from Prof. van der Heever that I learned that, in a free market economy, people say if you introduce social security, you stifle innovation. It's actually the other way around. When you have a sounding board or, something to catch yourself, you actually have greater innovation because you have something to fall back on. So we need to shift the discourse and what impact, positive impact that this will have on our country, particularly for, the wealthy who end up, always seem to get richer. But then I think finally it's important to note that it's the constitutional prerogative of the state to provide this. It's in our constitution. We have policies, we have laws, and we need to start meeting those commitments to the poorest in our country. And let me remind everyone that the basis of our constitution is the right to life and the right to dignity, and there's absolutely no dignity in being poor.
All right. Thanks for that, Yuri. Dr. Kelly, let me come to you. Give you a chance perhaps just to reflect on the questions we've had and perhaps then also give us your concluding remarks for this panel.
Thank you. The first thing to say is that I agree with the other panelists and those who have asked questions. 350 is entirely inadequate. But what we do have now is a window of opportunity. We essentially have a basic income grant in place, and now we need to push for the progressive realization, for the improvement of that grant over time. Just to say that 350 has no basis in any objective measure of need. That's what the national poverty lines do. They measure objective need in the community. And so the civil society organisations that we work with are calling for the grant to be increased to the value of at least the food poverty line from March next year. Remember, March next year is when the current regulations, is the end date for the current regulations that are governing the social relief of distress grant. So at that point, there is an opportunity to revisit and amend the framework for that grant. So we would like to see it increase to the food poverty line from March next year, and to see a clear pathway with binding targets and milestones adopted by the government towards realising a basic income grant and a universal basic income grant. In terms of the discussion about financing through new forms of taxation, the Institute for Economic Justice has a clear position on this issue, which we've put a number of outputs out elaborating on, but we are in support of the introduction of new progressive taxation measures to fund a universal basic income grant, and we are clear that this can be phased in a way that minimises risk to the fiscus. So this can include a wealth tax, but I want to emphasise the point that there are a number of options available for this. A number of options for redistributive taxes that mean that wealthy households and corporates pay more towards, so make a net contribution towards a basic income grant. So these kinds of options include a social security tax, which is ring-fenced for contributing to the basic income grant, and that's leveraged progressively against the highest income earners. It also includes reducing certain corporate tax subsidies that have been shown not to have positive policy impacts in terms of their policy intentions. And so I just want to emphasize that point. A wealth tax isn't the only option for a new progressive tax to fund a basic income grant. There are a number of options, and it's incredibly important to have this research, such as the panel's report and other modelling that has been done internationally, that shows that the idea that introducing these kinds of taxes with a view to generating redistributional impacts does not present as much of a risk to the economy, as much of a risk to the fiscus as we have been led to believe. In fact, what presents an enormous risk to the sustainability of our economy over time is the enormous levels of exclusion that we currently have. The proportion of people in our society who are excluded from participating, excluded from employment, excluded from being able to spend, to consume within their communities. And so the benefits of including those people in our economy, we maintain, vastly outweigh the risks of wealthy people paying moderately more into the social protection system. And I think that is certainly supported by the findings of the report and by international evidence.
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Kelly. And our next panel, of course, is going to be looking specifically at the economic and fiscal considerations, or the trade-offs, as Professor van der Heever describes it, and perhaps what some of the long-term then implications of those trade-offs might be. I know it's been an incredibly long morning so far. You've been listening diligently. You have earned yourself the right to a break at this particular juncture. So we're going to just take a quick tea break, and I'm going to ask that if we can be all back in this room and seated by 12:30, so that we get then into the final panel and do the official handover of the report. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you all for your contributions to the first half of this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, the break starts now.
Section 27(1)(c) of the South African Constitution states that everyone has a right to have access to social security and appropriate social assistance, including and not limited to if they are unable to support themselves and their dependents. Social assistance is funded by government revenue. This is what is referred to as social grants to vulnerable children, the elderly, and those with disabilities, administered and distributed by the Department of Social Development through its agency, South African Social Security Agency, SASSA.
When we talk about social security, we mean basically all the interventions that government has in place in order to address poverty, income poverty of people in the country. That means, from the definition that the Taylor Committee gave us in 2002, that we not only alleviate poverty in the form of social grants, but we also try to prevent poverty through creating mechanisms for people to actually save ahead of time for themselves, through institutions such as the Unemployment Insurance Fund, the Compensation Fund for Occupational Injuries and Diseases, and also the Road Accident Fund. So when we talk social security, it's not only grants. There are three elements to it. It's the social grants, which is the social assistance program funded by government through general taxes. And then there's contributions that people make through funds that are established in legislation, such as the Unemployment Insurance Fund, the Compensation Fund, and the Road Accident Fund. Those are mandatory funds to which people contribute.
Currently, the department spends about 3.5 billion rands per month, providing support to about 10.5 million people.
The Department of Social Development writes the policy on the different kinds of grants. The primary focus of those ones is for people who are vulnerable in the country. We have social grants for children from the age 0 all the way up to age 18, children who come from poor families. So the department has those child support grants. We also have foster child grants for children who have lost a parent, who are living with people who are not their biological parents. So the foster child grant is another kind of grant that we give. The other grant is the disability grant for persons with disability. We provide disability grants for children and also for adults. And the disability grant is also given on a temporary basis, but also we have the permanent one for people with permanent disability. Then we have the older persons grant, which is the one that is the most famous, the one that the Gogos go and queue for. That's the old age grant.
We visited Gogo Mildred Mtlalose, a 95-year-old pensioner living in Soweto. Gogo Mildred is a recipient of the social grant meant for the elderly.
Mina uMildred Mtlalose, ngihlala ezonde 689. Ngiyahola. Igrant ka-1 sengikhohliwe manje ukuthi 1,800. Le grant le ngiphiliswa yiyo ngoba ngisenabantwana. Yiyo esingiphilisa ngibhadale ogesi kathi ufile khona manje sakhipha imali enkulu 200. Ukudla la endlini. Abafana laba baphilanga banesifo sokuwa. Umfana oyedwa wentombi yami. Konke kubheke mina ngisenamntwana, abantwana abayinani base-Avalon, noyise nomakoti. Sengisele nabantwana abathathu abasebenzi. Lo munye uyagula naye. Sengisele nale ntombazane engibhekile la endlini. Iyangiphelele evikini lokugcina. Ngihambe ngiboleke komakhelwane abanosizo. Ngibuyisele mangihola. Njengoba izolo bengibabuyisele ngiboleke kubo.
In 2020, the unthinkable happened.
The National Coronavirus Command Council has decided to enforce a nationwide lockdown.
To reach the most vulnerable families in our country, we have decided on a temporary 6-month coronavirus grant.
So the COVID-19 grant, the cSRD grant that was introduced, was intended to support people of working age who did not have any means of supporting themselves during the period. So it was given to South Africans, but because there were also people in the country who are non-South Africans, who are asylum seekers, and those who are from Zimbabwe and Lesotho, who are permitted to be in the country, they have special permits to be in the country. They were also included because they were also in the same situation of not being able to work and not being able to survive without some sort of income support. So they were added to the beneficiaries that would access the 350 grant. So basically, those who were legally in the country at that time and could not work for themselves, they are also included in that 350 grant allocation. Initially, the allocation that was given was for around 6 million people, but then because COVID got extended, the grant was given from April up until October of 2020. Then because COVID went on for much longer than we thought, and the lockdown also went on for much longer than we thought, a decision was taken to extend the provision of the grant all the way up to April again of 2021. So after that, it became clear that because of COVID and its impact on the economy, the unemployment rates were continuing to grow and poverty levels were continuing to grow. Cost of living and cost of food was getting higher. So there was a much greater risk of people really falling into hunger. And so the decision was taken to extend the grant even further. So now the grant, this 350 grant has been extended all the way up to the end of the financial year now, March 2022. That's when the grant will be concluded in order to continue to provide the support that people continue to need.
Businesses like this are a typical feature in township street corners. The mystery, though, is what sustains them. For this young woman, the SASSA 350 Rand COVID-19 grant gave her the lifeline. In response to the crippling global pandemic, the government of South Africa swiftly introduced a special COVID-19 social relief distress grant of 350 in May 2020.
Dzina langa ndifi antenda urafundisana. Ndina miṅwaha ya 28. Ndibva Vondwe Rwavune abo Gumani. Ndita nga 7 machironi mamwe na mamwe. Ndibika vuswa na mkokoroshi na gandala nguluve na mara akhuhu na zwibilu. Ndi apply mahola nga June yeah na iwana uthoma nga November na bantu kuiveya then ndo didzula na bantu ku umbulo uri ndingathoma business ya mini nda umbulo uri ndiko tea thoma zwo bigger cause atina baby.
Before the 350 grand, Antendawo was already overcoming adversity with her parents dying while she was quite young and later becoming a mother in her teenage years. She says through her business, she now makes more than what SASSA gave her to kickstart the venture.
Utomana lockdown. Ndo itazokugula ka internet. Ndawana recipe yo ikapizza. Ndava ndikuita dzipizza ndikurengisa. Ndakonowana cherede. Cherede ndandikushumisa ya mwana ya mdende.
Her customers, who don't mind waiting while she prepares their first meal, were testament to the thriving business. Her meals sell for between 40 and 60 rand. Just 5 plates give her more than what she got from the 350 rand COVID grant in one day.
If ndoshuma zwavhuḓi ndakonoshuma 500 but if ndosongoshuma zwavhuḓi ndiyaswikisa 300.
While the debate and questions around whether 350 is enough rage on, the Minister of Social Development has made clear government's position on the matter.
350 came not as saying 350 is adequate. 350 can never be adequate. Let's put that straight. 350 is not enough. However, at the same time, we must appreciate the fact that if government on its own is got a particular amount of money which it collects as taxes from everybody, puts it in a pot and then decides how do we divide it. We divide it to schooling, we're dividing it to health, we are dividing it to roads, we are dividing it to social grants, the social grants which we pay to 18 million people.
Antendawo is no longer a 350 rand beneficiary because she is now self-sufficient. This is government's vision to see more social grant beneficiaries who swim against the high tide of inequality do well enough to make a living. This opens up space on the grant system to alleviate poverty to many others.
My name is Ngobile Khumalo from Warrenton. I'm 26 years old. I'm a poultry farmer.
My name is Bongiwe Khumalo. I'm from Warrenton, Northern Cape. I'm 21 years old. I'm a poultry farmer.
And we are sisters. Ukuqala kwethu ukusave ama-350 saba motivated ngenkathi sasiye kwi-farm it was a farm day, was hosted by Bur Bay, so we went there to visit. We're not farming that time. And then coming back, we were inspired because the other youth are doing great jobs. So I have to take time to convince her to save ama-350. So she fall for it. She save, but because we did go there, and then siyaku agriculture now because we heard ukuthi kunama channel is not about ukuthi kumele ube umuntu wesilisa to farm ne. It took me time really to convince Bongiwe Khumalo. It was a time, but yes, our convince we besibeka imali yethu besibeka u700 but it was 350. Remember ukuthi government was introduce ukuthi abantu bangabe unomntwana you have to get u500. I registered and then I got i500 for as umzali nginomntwana. So mangithola i500 it speed up a process ukuthi imali yethu ifikelele ku5000. So siqali ke sabeka ke until ku5000. Masibona ukuthi okay sesiyakwazi ukuthenga inkukhu, siyakwazi ukuthenga amafeeder awu4, and then siyakwazi ukuthenga ama-drinkers. Sahamba sayothenga ke nama-feeds. Sahamba sayothenga ngale 5000 saqala sa-order i-first bench yethu. I-first bench yethu siqale nge-17 July 2021. It was our first bench, our first experience ukukhulisa inkukhu. So we were so excited, and then our first bench sayisela a chicken farm. So we were so motivated to go for it ukuthi yazini we can do this. So sakhula lapho ke.
Go tshimolola ga rona re tshimotse last year, it was 2021 ka July ka re tshimolola mo gae mo ntlong e papa na sa berekisi ka papa a re adima ntlo ewa. So ka go bona opportunity ya re berekise re dire poultry farming mo go yone. So papa rona le mama rona ba re supportile thata ga ba le mo gapandaka.
As abantu bebengazi nix ngenkukhu, I did esikoleni ngenza maths and physics, and then yena usisi wami wenze i-tourism ne. Mina efela mastad I went to college ka 2017 to do my paramedic and firefighter 1 operation hazmat. I was there doing it. I was so happy, and then coming back thinking you're gonna get a job, it was very painful to not having a job. Every day you have to run up and down envelope. If there's a post, you are the one that applying, you want to be the first. So we were so encouraged to start, and then we overcome the challenges to raise the chicken as we don't have any experience. We're using Google to raise our chicken. It was a Google, every day we're Googling, and YouTube, watching those young farmers, how they do it, which vaccination they're using it, and then joining the group on Facebook to get the experience and to know how people they're doing it. So we're so excited. That's how we overcome the challenges. Uma inkukhu zethu siyithola zina 1 day.
old, so we have to raise it until 6 weeks, taking care of it, checking what is the vaccinated, we're checking medication, what is medication right, they are growing healthy, and then sisithola to the company Sterfontein company that are delivering inkukhu zethu, where we fetch it Pumla garage and then coming here and then sizo deliver, and then it's well prepared already, my figures barrights. Sithanda ukubingelela ukubonga bonke abantu abasupportile and abantu abahlezi besupporta buying chicken zethu, and tell ama comments, a positive comment are the ones that keep us going. Siyabonga kakhulu, siyabonga isupport yenu, and we want to encourage youth out there ukuthi senza emva kwendlu backyard, so you can, anything is possible. You can start where you are, what you have, it's possible if you are doing it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
This is Warrington Primary School in the Northern Cape. This school became the saving grace for two young men who used their 350 grants to start a small-scale crop farming project.
Me and my brother, we get the money from SASA 350, then with that 350 we contribute 150, then we start to buy seeds, then we do seedlings, then we start our first production here.
The young men gained access to this piece of land through the school principal, who said while the school benefited from the project, it was also important to give this pair a chance in the midst of high unemployment.
Right here in Maharing, we're having a problem of unemployment, and then when they approached me to use the land, and then I said, no man, seeing that we don't use that land effectively, let me rather take them and then take the opportunity to come and use this land effectively, so that at the end of the day there must be something that they get, because there are that is a portion that the school is getting, and then the other portion they are getting, then they can sell it for themselves, so that they can have something.
There isn't any vegetables to show off as yet, but the young men don't reap what they sow alone. They share the spoils with the school's feeding scheme project.
The reason that there are no plants here today is because we are preparing the land. We just came from our production. Now we need to prepare, because we are coming to the seasons as well are changing, you see. So we must prepare for the other season. That's hence you are seeing there are no veggies here. But within a period of 3 weeks' time, I'm obviously sure this place will be nice and attractive.
It is their hope that the project will inspire more young people into agriculture.
We had the courage, me and him, like the burning desire of running things like this, especially in the parts of agriculture. Yes, but we need young people to engage more further into agriculture, because as we take a close look, agriculture is the backbone of our economy. So we cannot shy away from the means of development, you see.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Testing 1, 2, there we go. Good afternoon, everyone. I trust you've had a sugar-filled tea break and have got enough energy to make it through the final session of this morning, which is also going to take a look at our second panel discussion. For this conversation, we'll be unpacking the economic and fiscal considerations of the SRD. And this debate is often a very economic debate. I'm looking at Dominic and I'm looking at Professor van der Heerden, and I'm thinking about how often the conversation is had through the framework of traditional economics or traditional frameworks around how our budgeting has worked. And Dominique is one of those that will always say that, look, there are alternatives and we need to be looking at what the alternative approach, even just to budgeting, can be in this country. So I'm looking forward to seeing how the exchange between the two of you is going to unfold. Let me invite or officially introduce our panelists for this particular conversation. Professor Jan van Heerden is with the University of Pretoria. Dominic Brown is with the Alternative Information and Development Center. And joining us virtually, Dr. Gilad Isaacs, who is with the Institute for Economic Justice. Dr. Isaacs, can you hear me loud and clear? If you can just please say hello so we can make sure that you're well connected.
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. I hope I am coming through, and thanks very much for this invitation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. So, Professor van Heerden, let's begin with you and perhaps your own considerations when we think about the economic and fiscal considerations of this grant. What are some of the big issues on your list that we need to be looking at?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. So I thought, and I cannot really comment on the report because I'm part of the report. So I thought I would say what surprised me through the modeling, because it's true that a CGE model and I suppose a macro model, many economic models, before you run the simulations, you have to think what will the outcomes be? What do you expect the model to tell you? And then the model very, very often surprises you. So what were the surprises? So a year ago with the first panel, we were still thinking of let's increase VAT by 1%. We haven't touched the wage subsidy. So we've really moved from the first report to the second report, moved a very long way forward. And as Alex has shown, that VAT is absolutely taboo. That's just the one thing. Because, I had to think before today, what is the big difference between funding through VAT and
I think they lost you.
The income tax on the richer groups? And then when the general was speaking, it just dawned on me, it's exactly the same thing. How can you increase the VAT rate, give the grant to a poor person, and that person also has to pay 14, 15, 16% or the increase on some of the commodities that they buy. So it's like giving with one hand and taking away with the other. And that's a big difference between the VAT funding. You take money from everybody, from rich and poor. Well, if you fund with a PAT only on the highest 3 deciles, and all of us are included in if not the highest, at least the highest 3 deciles, then it's really redistributive. You take away from the rich and you give to the poor. So that's why the PIT really works very well with the distribution numbers. But the surprise is that it's also much better on the economy. And why is that? Because if you increase VAT by 2%, which we did in the simulation, then all prices go up by 2%.
Yes.
And so inflation goes up. We saw increases in inflation. We know that that is bad for the economy. So it's just so clear-cut that we shouldn't even consider VAT. But the surprise was that the income tax funding was neutral on growth, and one had to think, but why did it work? And what's happening is, if you tax the rich with income tax, then they're going to spend less. So if they spend less, then demand decreases from their side, and that will decrease prices on many of the goods in the economy, the ones that the rich spend their money on. Yes, food will increase if you give grants to the poor, because they will buy more of it, and if there's a higher demand for goods, then so prices are a bit distorted. But the fact that you take away from the rich, then they have to start thinking twice. What are they going to do with the remainder of their money? And they will then start spending it more intelligently. They will waste less money. So, Alex, there was a very, very interesting remark. He mentioned it this morning. I don't know if you heard, but so why do the simulations show a move away from services back into manufacturing? It just is so confusing, because if countries grow, we know that they go out of manufacturing into services. And here in these simulations, we see the reverse. And that's exactly because of the fact that the rich spend a lot of their money on services, and the poor spend their money on food, textiles, little things that are manufactured. So if you give money to the poor, they will buy small manufacturing goods, including food, and the rich will spend less on services. So that's why there's a move out of services into manufacturing.
Just touch on the compounded effect, Prof, of the compounding effect of VAT, just in terms of exacerbating the reason why VAT, you think, should not be an option.
The big difference between, well, the model is driven by price changes. That's if something becomes cheaper, all of us want to buy more of it. And if something becomes more expensive, we want to buy less of it. So if in the VAT simulation, we actually saw that everybody, rich and poor, buy less of everything, because things become more expensive. So it's bad for the economy, but there's a general decrease in demand. While with the income tax, it's different. You give money to somebody and they can go and spend it, and they don't have to contribute towards the grants. And that's why there are some positive economic effects and negative. But that is just negative, because all prices increase and everybody demands less. And if our prices increase, we become less competitive in the world. So then the world also will see, well, South Africa is more expensive, let's go and buy from other countries.
All right. Dominic, let me give you a chance perhaps to also give us some of your own considerations in as far as this conversation is concerned.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for the invitation to be here, especially to the Department of Social Development and the expert panel, who I think is doing encouraging work. And so I think this second report is a very good basis for us to work from. And I think it's extremely encouraging that you've come to the same conclusion that we have 4 years ago, that implementing a basic income grant through financing it with increased VAT is not the means to do it, as it will dampen the possibility for alleviating poverty and inequalities through the reduction of disposable income. And more than that, I think we know we have the most unequal country in the world, both in terms of income and wealth. And so more than 25 years after the 1997 White Paper on Social Expanded or Comprehensive Social Security, more than 2 decades after the Taylor Report, we're in a situation, obviously, where we need a basic income grant more than ever. It's almost an idea whose time has come. And the only stumbling block, it seems, is a treasury dogmatically committed to an austerity, a neoliberal austerity agenda, regardless of the socio-economic costs and expenses that arises because of this. And it's not only about what you spend money on that's indicative of a neoliberal austerity agenda. It's also about how you raise money. And since 1996, South Africa has put the ceiling on the tax to GDP ratio of 24%. This is above 40% lower than the OECD average. And this capping of the overall tax burden has tremendously benefited the affluent and the rich in this country. And what we have seen is that this has prevented government, constrained government from raising additional resources through taxation. And so, for example, we see for personal income tax rates, for instance, and when we look at effective personal income tax rates, we see that there's been a massive decline of more than 30% over the past 20 years, from 2003 till now. When 2003, the personal income or effective personal income tax rate was around 34%, whereas in 2018, it was 18%. So the implication of this is that those top three income brackets that you speak about are paying way less in real terms than they have 20 years ago. And we can see this happening year after year when the government continuously allows tax rebates for medical aid contributions, pension fund contributions. Often this is going into the billions. And we've seen it again this year while you're cutting budgets and social protection in real terms. So while we're having this argument about or discussion for a basic income grant, which is actually requiring a greater level of spending in relation to social protection in nominal and real terms, we're seeing a slashing of social protection in real terms over the medium-term expenditure framework. So this begs the question, the billion rand question, where will the money come from to finance this basic income grant? And I just did a back of the envelope calculation. I didn't want to use 350 rand. I think it's a bit disingenuous, you know? And so I took General Moyo's 1,500 rand. And I took your 13.1 million beneficiaries. Just multiplied by 12 months. You get something between, if you take 1,335 rand, the upbound poverty level, or 1,500 rand per month, you get between 208 billion and 250 billion, something like that, per annum gross cost. So this is not once you claw back some of the costs through value-added taxes and through greater productivity, because you will see a multiplier effect within the economy. And I'm not a modeler. I don't know how to do R and regressive analysis, but I'm more from a political economy side, and there we can see, where was I? 200 billion. So if we just restore the personal income tax rate, effective tax rate of the early 2000s, you raise about 160 billion rand a year. That's almost 80% of the total amount of the gross cost. And this is only really the beginning, because many people have spoken about the real problem in this country, which is the problem of wealth. Now, while you have concentrated wealth, you also get income derived from wealth. This is also very undertaxed in this country. And so there's room, for example, to increase the level of capital gains taxes, which will then reduce the level of incomes that the wealthy earn from their assets. And more than that, I think it's about time, given the legacy of dispossession, apartheid, segregation, and the past 30 years of neoliberal exploitation and oppression. It seems when you have 3,500 individuals who have the same amount of wealth as the 32 million most impoverished people in this country, that to implement a net progressive wealth tax of between 3 and 7% on the top 1% is something that should have been done 20 years ago. And Arup Chatterjee and others from WITS argue that even after you put in this net progressive wealth tax on this top 1%, of which 30% will avoid paying the tax altogether, you raise another 143 billion rand. Then we also lose a huge amount of money as a result of capital outflows, both licit and illicit. So the Financial Intelligence Center, for example, indicates that South Africa loses between $15 billion and $25 billion each year as a result of profit shifting. At the same time, as a result of the reduction in capital and exchange controls, we also lose about 150 billion to 200 billion rand each year due to dividends and interest payments to non-resident bondholders. So if you stop capital outflows, reduce the level of profit shifting by these big corporations, once again, there's large pools of finances. And I think you can really go on and on in the South African context where there's an abundance of resources, not least if you turn to resources in the form of idle capital, where corporations find it more lucrative to put their money in bank accounts and earn interest on it than investing in the real economy. So what we're really arguing for is a break from this idea that you have to service your debt at all other costs, and that you can in fact simultaneously deal with debt and the social crisis through a fiscal stimulus, a well-directed fiscal stimulus, which includes a cash transfer to those who are unemployed and or do not have sufficient income. And it's not just this unemployment problem where you have half the working age population unemployed. It's also a problem of a low income regime, a low wage regime, where, and that's why more than half the population is living on below 1,335 rand per month. So ultimately, the question about the costs of the basic income grant is a question of power. It's not a technical question about if there's the resources or not. Because the minute you look into, as General and you say, Dr. van der Heever, Van Heerden, sorry, I'm mixing you two up, is that when you tax the rich, right, you are taking on a minority, a very small elite in this country, and their interests are often aligned with the political elite. And so to be able to take them on is a big question of power. And so it doesn't surprise me that how keen the Department of Social Development is to advance a basic income grant, but is unable to achieve it because we have a treasury who's dogmatically following this neoliberal economic agenda.
All right. Dominic, I'm going to pause you there. Let me invite Dr. Gillard Isaacs. Gillard, you also have an opportunity just to give us your own contributions to lay the foundation for this discussion.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Kathy, and to everybody. Firstly, well done to the panel, both for the insights to move forward with this type of modeling and the work which has been undertaken. As Alex says, I do think that this raises the bar and sort of places higher expectations on the conversation. Before offering a few thoughts, my first thought, which I must note, is that I all of that said, I am a little bit cautious of the results of such modeling exercises. In particular, the CGE model, which has been used, is, in my mind, one which makes a number of deeply flawed assumptions about the economy. And I don't want to go into what a colleague of mine always calls technobabble, and to, depart from what's interesting to the general audience. But suffice to say that all of these models make assumptions on how the economy actually operates. And very much what you input is then your output is determined by the nature of how that model works. There's a very small example in the report itself where it refers on a number of occasions to the assumption that the wage subsidy actually results in lower cost of the produced items, and that the wage subsidy isn't captured by businesses, where of course we know that a share of the wage subsidy is indeed captured by businesses. That's a very small example, and there are much more fundamental ones. That said, there is two questions. The one is, how does this modeling exercise do? And the other is, well, how do we evaluate those things in general? And despite my sort of broad caution around this form of modeling, I think this modeling exercise does unusually well at capturing what we know are fundamental elements of the economy. And we can evaluate against what we see in the real world, right? How things have worked out elsewhere, and how things do actually play out. So let's just look at that for a minute, okay? On the question, and I'm looking here at the economic, fiscal, macro implications, because that's our theme. We know, as Jan says, that it's well established that the poor consume a higher share of their income than wealthier people. It's therefore unsurprising to me that a tax on personal income, which is then which only a higher share pay, which is then handed over to lower income households, has a positive economic impact. We know from other studies, and these are not quite the same as a macro study, but they are the sort of foundational building blocks, that social transfers have what's called multiplier effects. For instance, in Ethiopia, with each birr of finances paid through an income support experiment, there was between a 1.35 and a 2.5 economic benefit to the communities. And we know that similarly in Africa, for instance, from Namibia, from Zambia, and elsewhere. And these are sort of much smaller experiments, but these multiplier effects occur. We also know that the outcome of this modeling concurs with the outcome of other modeling. Also, some of that I would critique in the same way, but the ITUC, for instance, did modeling on Rwanda, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ghana, and others, and showed that there was a similar multiplier effect. Locally, ADRS shows that too. On tax and debt financing, the same study which I mentioned on a range of countries also show a significant multiplier in government revenue, so that distributions of these sorts return to the fiscus. Another ITUC study shows similar results with regards to financing mechanisms, right? That progressive taxes lead to increased growth, beneficial employment outcomes, positive benefits for low-income households, and so on. Whereas regressive taxes have negative output impacts, negative employment impacts, and so this also matches with the kinds of outputs which we've seen here. So in general, the modeling outputs are reinforced in many ways by both other types of modeling outputs and by the real world consequences that we've seen, although, as I say, those aren't in a direct comparable way. Two very last things. The one broader point which the report opens with, which I would argue is more like settled than the report indicates, is in its introduction. It says essentially everyone knows that social security helps low-income households. Okay, what's debated is whether this help is at the detriment of broader economic indicators, and that they pose as an open question. And I would argue that the broad international evidence, including from the IMFs and so on, is that inequality is bad for economic growth, and that question is somewhat more settled than is implied. And we should start from a premise of course, each circumstances will differ, but that we know that measures to reduce inequality are substantially likely to have positive economic impacts. Lastly, is what do we need from here in my mind? Well, I think we need to root this conversation more deeply in the South African context, in terms of the macro fiscal picture. As has been said already, there are sources of increased taxation. The IEJ has concretely quantified those. The social security tax, for instance, which is similar to a personal income tax, although ring-fenced, in our projections based on between 1.5 and 3% of income, raises about 60 billion rand, for instance. And many of the other tax options which have been mentioned, we've looked at in this conversation. But debt financing is not a dirty word, and the current drawdown on our debt, which is much, much faster in the current medium-term expenditure framework than it was a year or two ago, should also be raised as a question mark in the context of such severe needs. We also need to move on to having a conversation on universality, on increasing those that have access, and to increasing the level of the basic income support, as well as exploring this from other modeling perspectives, which might be open to other forms of criticism also. Very lastly, is we now need to say, and I think this is a key benefit of this report, is okay, those who are critical, those who argue against basic income support, firstly, what's your alternative, right? How do we deal not with the And we need to deal with the unemployment crisis. We need to deal with other forms of economic crisis. But what is the alternative for the widespread levels of destitution and hunger? And where's your evidence? Let's not hear you saying, "Oh, it's not affordable. Oh, it's going to cause this thing," because somehow those that are opposed get away with the most vaguest, most evidence informed inputs. And it's now time, with this panel having done really concrete work for those who wish to offer an alternative, to actually bother to provide the same level of rigor and evidence as we've seen from this work.
All right.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for that, Dr. Isaacs. I just wanted you to perhaps just on the caution that you're applying in terms of this report and the concerns that you have around the modeling used. If this report is taken and given to, for example, hypothetically speaking, some very cynical individuals in the Office of the National Treasury who may or may not be finding reason to continue with the grant, do you think that it can withstand that kind of scrutiny?
The benefit, Kathy, and the strategic choice which the panel cleverly made is that this is the exact criticisms I'd have of the National Treasury's modeling, that this model which has been chosen to use is in the same family as the ones that National Treasury uses and defends, and in fact is a much more sophisticated version of the extremely superficial and recurringly inaccurate projections which we receive from the CGE models which National Treasury uses. So the benefit which we have here is that I have my cautions, as do many others, around CGE modelings, but it would be incredibly hypocritical, even a step too far for the hypocrisy which we often see from National Treasury to go after this on the basis of the architecture of the model, when it's in fact a family of models to which they use, subscribe, defend, and which theirs is just a poorer version of.
Fair enough. I imagine there was some consideration about this, and I'll give you a moment just to respond, Professor Van Heerden. In a moment, I am going to also be taking questions from the floor, specifically related to matters of the economic considerations that we're discussing now over this grant.
So I've lost sound my side, Kathy. Sorry to interrupt. I can't hear you anymore.
All right, I'll ask them to work on it. Just hang 10.
I can hear now.
Fantastic.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, great. So, Prof, did you think about how far this research could go, especially in a more formal context of influencing the debate around the basic income grant?
I hope that they will listen, and I'm glad that Isaac thinks that our model is better than the National Treasury. So it's actually Alex who started the whole project choosing CGE. But on models, I mean, obviously Isaac is correct that every model has some flaws. You cannot do everything. I always tell the students that a model is like a roadmap. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember that we actually had little books of road maps of Pretoria, Johannesburg, and so on. But if you can follow the roads and you can get from A to B using that map, but there's no street lights on the map, there's no trees, there's not much detail. It just helps you to get from point A to point B. And even though our assumptions may not be liked by the readers, we did 3 simulations using the same assumptions. So we compared VAT with PIT, with the wage subsidy with the same model, so we can compare the three outcomes. And I think that's the strength of this study. And the surprise thing that we didn't even think of last year was that the mixture between wage subsidy in some form and a PIT or a wealth tax or some tax where you tax a rich is the goal to which we should know. But perhaps I can give them some inside information, Alex, but in one of the very first panel meetings, Alex said, well, the first goal is just to get a permanent grant. That's it, we want to go beyond 2023, 2024, and hopefully we will achieve that at least, and then we can go on and refine the tax systems in many of the ways that Dominique has proposed, test some of those. So it's a step. Every year I think we can get closer to the ultimate solution.
Sure. Dominique?
I mean, I would just like to say that for me, this model almost provides a kind of worst case scenario. And even in the worst case scenario, it says it's viable, it's feasible, without much constraints on the fiscus, and with almost quite a significant, I should say, improvement on people's lives. And that, from what I'm hearing from the panel, they went with the very entry level, just as you say, to get a permanent grant. But in reality, there's not, as if there's not more space to push for even better and more decent kind of cash transfers. So even if you critique models in general, the base of microeconomics modeling, I mean, this shows it can't get worse than this for the state. And I think it's a very powerful argument that we can make. And then we can use to say, but there's also room for more.
Sure. And I think, the important that, or rather the issue that Dr. Isaacs raised that I thought was very important is that it's often those on the end of the debate that say there must be a basic income grant that are expected to provide the evidence around why this will work, how it can work. And earlier there was an issue raised about what happens if we do the maths, if we do the calculation of what happens if we don't have this grant. What is the cost of not having this grant? And the extent to which that also needs to be done so that we can have an honest conversations about what the trade-offs are, if in fact it is a conversation about trade-offs. Where is the roving microphone? If I can please see...
Kathy, if I can just say one short thing.
Sure,
sorry.
sure.
Whilst you find that microphone. I mean, I agree with that, and I take the point that this is a good starting point, these scenarios. What I think we need to move on to, though, is to think about this process as a roadmap, right? And to think about what those steps are and what those various paths are. And Jan, I'm old enough to also remember using actual paper maps. But what are the 2 or 3 avenues for that? Okay, we start where we are now. We then improve the level. We then expand the access. We then explore these type of financing mechanisms. And that's the work which we've started our side with another modeling exercise. I think it would be great if the expert panel and others also picked up, there maybe this might be in everyone's mind already, and I think that the panel went back to sort of first principles and started with a really simple set of scenarios around where we are now was a good and appropriate choice. But the building on that means a design of a concrete pathways towards achieving a higher level with comprehensive access progressively financed. And we need to understand what those paths are and what their impact might be.
Sure. Thanks for that. The microphone, okay? If we can please get the microphone to Prof. van der Heever here. I think he wants an opportunity to speak a little bit, defend his work. And then after that, we'll move on to Isabel, and I'll take any other hands on the left side of the room. Yes, Prof.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I think the one thing on the wage subsidy, it's, Isaac is exactly correct. We took the most optimistic version of that, where the entire subsidy accrues to the employees. That's not what would necessarily occur in reality, so one would have to qualify it. But we had qualified it saying, I mean, we weren't trying to make a case for it. We're showing, here is what a wage subsidy looks like, here is its structure, and we wanted to understand the most optimistic version of it. What are the likely effects economically, distributionally, and we've got that picture. Everything else is just, if it dissipated, if you lost half of it, then it'll be half the value of what we assessed for the same subsidy. So yes, that would be the kind of risk. And we did say that a wage subsidy, if it's created, you'd have to design it very carefully to be able to target these groups, because the stuff leaks upwards. On the multiplier issues, again, we effectively eliminated multipliers as a conversation in this, because the Reserve Bank, National Treasury, etc., produced papers attacking what they'd regard as overly generous multiplier effects in this. So our analysis just eliminates multipliers from the discussion. We analyzed the most conservative position, balanced budget approach. Essentially, that means the tax multipliers, which are negative multipliers, balance out the positive expenditure multipliers, and we don't evaluate it. We also did evaluate what we called free lunch options in the first version. The only thing that we can't be sure of, you can get very significant multipliers, but we don't know the extent to which we will capture the benefits in the domestic economy. So for instance, if you have very strong multiplier effects and people start to import a lot of goods, for instance, then you have negative balance of payments effects, which then tend to undermine your growth effects. And you might overstate your tax recoveries from that stimulus. But in reality, you've undermined the sustainability of the overall economy. And at the end of the day, you end up with less tax intake. And we felt we couldn't model that. So we didn't try. But in this version, basically, we're saying there could be, you could argue that, but we would have to analyze multiplier effects as a specific exercise. And I think it's worthwhile doing. But we'd have to evaluate it not in as it would occur in Rwanda or Ethiopia. We'd have to look at it in relation to the domestic economy. And if there are those gains, we would probably not be doing it saying we're going to finance half this grant increase using debt financing. That would probably be a very high risk thing to do. But the point is, we've analyzed it on a fully financed basis, and nobody can question that. Then on the progressive issue going forward, absolutely, in the case of what Isaac and the rest, the roadmap issue is essentially every increment. What one's said here is we're prepared to analyze everything. And in terms of incremental adjustments, they can be analyzed as well. But the key risk issue that's been raised is that this is a high-risk type of thing to do. What the analysis starts to show is it's not as risky as you're saying. And once that becomes part of the conversation, then you only analyze the true risks, not the fake risks.
Sure. Thanks for that, Prof. Let me get the mic to Isabel, please, on the side of the room.
I have one.
Oh, okay, great.
Thank you. Thank you, and I just want to congratulate the authors of the report. I think that the evidence, the empirical evidence that it contains is really helpful. And I think to DSD and also to the ILO for seeing how to creatively respond to institutional challenges that they face was really useful. I just wanted to make 4 quick points. I think firstly on inequality, what's interesting is if you look at the South African Social Attitudes Survey, SASAS, there's a very strong public opinion across the various income deciles and also race that inequality needs to be tackled. So ordinary people, not just people living in poverty, think that inequality is unsustainable and undermines the social fabric. And I think that's something which we need to put into the narrative a lot more unapologetically. It's almost like we come in and say, well, I'm sorry to say this, because inequality makes our country dysfunctional, and we see that on a daily basis. So, and the reason I raise that is, do we add a wealth tax? Often people say, if you say that, then people won't support it, so let's not raise it. I do think that we need to be unapologetic. I think the next point is just about employment. A research paper that Duma Klubule wrote for us at SPY, in the absence of any intervention, by 2030 we're going to have a 50% unemployment rate, and that translates into almost 17 million people living without income. So the kinds of interventions that DSD is proposing now would preempt the scale of that. And then looking into industrial policy as well as employment generation. But on that, again, we need to see public investment, because the paper looks at the phases of GEAR, which is 96 to 2003, post-GEAR 2004 to 2009, and then the last decade from 2009. And where public investment leads, such as the post-GEAR phase, you see an increase in growth, increase in jobs, and a decrease in poverty. But as soon as that's withdrawn, and the state says we don't have money to spend, then you see a massive increase in the fundamentals. So it's not rocket science. And maybe it's not quite back of the envelope either, Dominic. But, I mean, there's a direct link there. Third point is the composition of spend. And I think one of the missing people in the room, sectors in the room, are small business. Now, organized big business has a very different message to say. I sit on the National Minimum Wage Commission. People didn't want to increase the national minimum wage this year at all. They said that business was suffering on their profits. Therefore, workers should not get an increase. And that's not going to be the outcome. But I mean, that's the point. And then I said to them, but you can't argue against wages and you argue against basic income grant. Yeah. I said, like, where are people meant to get the income? And I said, go back and get a new mandate from the retailers, because it's the retailers, as has been said here, that benefit. But I think the small business sector would be the ones who have the most immediate interface with spenders of social grants. And it would be really great to see the ministry on the panel next time we have a discussion, to see what are the kinds of ways in which we lock money into that multiplier, which people have been speaking about. And then finally, and I'm sorry that it's finally, because it really should be first, but from a human rights perspective, the state has a constitutional obligation to progressively realize, and as people have been saying, we start there. We start small, as we used to say in 2002, and grow big. But the challenge is there. And I think that hashtag Pay the Grants has got a huge potential to organize feet on the ground, because however useful this report is, I think it's the political that will bring leadership to listen. And possibly 2024 around the corner would be a political window in which the other parts of the basic income grant discussion, people would directly affected by poverty and civil society come to the fore. But again, it's a great addition to the research and the documentation of the arguments. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Isobel. I'm going to move to the right side of the room. I'm mindful of the time. We've got only 6 minutes remaining for this session. Any hands on the right side of the room? I think it's none at all. Okay, then you can absolutely grab that opportunity.
Yeah, yeah, sure, thanks. I'm quite confounded by the proposal of the wage subsidy, something we opposed when it was first suggested by Treasury. Of course, back then, it was nothing but it is social security to businesses. So if we take it out of the revenue pot and we put it back into this program, we're basically taking money and giving it back. Help me understand it. That's one part. The other part, of course, is, and let's come to the issue of power. Treasury doesn't have to explain. It doesn't have to provide evidence. And the other party that reinforces that power is the media. When this thing was announced 2-3 months ago, you had pictures on one of the national newspapers showing people leaving the country. I mean, we need the media to also interrogate the national treasury and say, on what basis do you make these points? Thank you. By the way, subsidy issue I'm curious about.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, so the wage subsidy isn't a proposal, a policy proposal. It's an analysis because it's the kind of thing that's being proposed. So we also want to understand it. So the issue is that we have no real idea, because I'm afraid the people who've proposed wage subsidies, who've proposed special employment programs, don't analyze them. So what we've shown here is we've surfaced the dynamics, but what we haven't also done is propose it at a programmatic level. We haven't said this is the program we should implement. We did it at the same value, so we'd have a side-by-side comparison. And what it showed was its distributional effects are weak. Its economic effects, assuming no leakage, which is a big assumption, has a positive economic outcome from the model. So it's the most positive version of that particular proposal. But we understand it then. But it's also very difficult to target. But in essence, we wanted to understand it so that if it's part of the conversation, we can talk to it. But otherwise, the people who propose it will propose it in a vague mist as an alternative program. Now we've got a concrete assessment of it.
All right. Thanks for that, Professor van der Heever. And we certainly take the point that you're making there, Dr. Selwyn, in terms of the extent to which we as the media are also looking at this debate and are interrogating fully both sides of the debate. I do find that, like I said to you, before a couple of years back when I had a nice little debate with Isabel, I was on the fence. I knew it was important to give people support, but also, where will the money come from? Because that's literally the question that every other economist that you talk to about the basic income grant asks you. And so information like this and research like this, I think in many ways also just empowers the media to have better conversations around this issue. All right, so I think that on that note, then we're going to wrap it up with the second panel. I'm looking at the time. If you guys can be trusted with a minute each, I can give you a minute each to just conclude for me, please. Prof?
Thank you very much. I have a note on what we have not modeled. There are so many things that we can model. So bad luck is not the worst case. So if we would build in the red tape, and the cost of means testing, the situation would look worse. But if we could build in the benefits, and if we have the data of people now sending their kids to school, being educated, or going to the pharmacy and buying medicine and being more healthy, if we can build that into the positive and negatives, then there's a lot of work still to be done.
All right. Dominic?
I think we all know South Africa is at a tipping point. We need to urgently ameliorate the socioeconomic crisis, and the basic income grant can be part of that solution. And so it should be something that we push for quite urgently. And I think we should be going for around the upper bound poverty level, given the crisis in this country. But it's not a panacea. And as much as I think we need to push for this urgent implementation of a basic income grant and for its progressive realization, it needs to come with the restructuring of our economy so that we can reindustrialize towards a low-carbon economy that creates tons of jobs and redistributes wealth. And lastly, if you implement the basic income grant and you don't do this, and you continue to see the commodification of services, privatization of energy, of transport, and so on, even if the grant's 15,000 rand per month, people will be impoverished because you'll pay through your teeth for all of these things. So it's a combination that we require. It's rethinking the economy, but with the first target, implementing a basic income grant so that people can actually live. Because right now, people are not living a decent life.
All right. Dr. Isaacs, I'm going to give you the last word.
Thanks very much. Just to say that it's been a pleasure to be a part of this. I think that work like this is very usefully at the intersection of what research and evidence can bring to a very real and very concrete and very urgent policy conversation. As the Institute, we look forward to continuing to work with DSD, the expert panel, the ILO, and others in managing to deepen the debate and leverage research in the way in which this report has undertaken. So thanks very much. Congrats to the panel, and look forward to further engagement on what is one of South Africa's most pressing and most urgent policy conversations.
Sure, thank you so much. That's Dr. Gillard Isaacs. He's with the Institute for Economic Justice. Of course, Dominic Brown is with the Alternative Information and Development Center, and Prof. van der Heerden is with the University of Pretoria. Let's give them a round of applause, please. Well, this officially brings us towards the end of our program. Of course, we can't really end without there being the official handover of this report. I'm going to invite onto stage Sis Brenda Sibeko, who is the DDG for Comprehensive Social Security. Is the DG here? Oh, there we go. Oh, he's hiding there in the back. Okay. I didn't see you. Apologies. Okay, so I'm going to ask then Dr. Johnny of the ILO, and of course the DG, to come and do the official handover of this report. I don't know if there are any words that any of you want to offer at this moment. You've spoken enough. Any words you want to offer?
Maybe just to when I was reading everybody's profile, I came across somebody who played basketball for a national team for over 13 years. And you can just look at the tallest person on the stage and you'll know who I'm talking about. But really, we want to thank the ILO for the partnership, and really to thank all the panel members and all the contributors, the NGOs, and everybody who's contributed towards this work. This is dedicated to all the South African citizens in this country, particularly the poorest of the poor. So we want to appreciate this opportunity. We'll take it and use it effectively as we work towards the implementation of the policy of the basic income grant. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. You can give it a round of applause. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. You can tell that this launch is happening just a couple of weeks before Christmas and New Year, right? You're seeing red ribbons, you're seeing fireworks. Everybody in the technical team was like, okay, guys, we're closing it off with a bang. We're getting ready for the last leg of the year. This, of course, brings us to the end of our program. But to officially come and give the closing remarks for today, you may have heard her name mentioned a number of times throughout the session. Please help me welcome onto stage Ms. Brenda Sibeko, who is the DDG for Comprehensive Social Security. Let's give her a round of applause, please.
Thank you very much, Kathy, who's now become a friend of the department. not to say that you're embedded, but it's really, really good to work with you. You've come to grasp the issues that we grapple with. So I must thank you for facilitating this session for us and ensuring that everyone gets to have their say. And I must also thank the ILO. They've walked a journey with us since the beginning of this work, and even broader work that you are doing on the social security system and how to improve it. So the work we do is not only about the social grants, but also about people who are working and are not able to find a platform through which they can save for a rainy day. We're also doing that work and looking at institutional ways of ensuring that the social security system is accessible to everyone and affordable and efficient and so on. So I'm very happy to continue working with you. And a lot of the members of the panel who helped us with the first panel report and even with this one, thank you very much for the work that you've continued to do for us. The commitment you have shown, the willingness to hear our views sometimes when we didn't really understand these very complex things, and for walking along the road with us and continuing to fight the battle with us, for the poor in this country to also have their rights met, for the constitutional obligations that this government has to also be implemented. That's really the foundation of the work that we're doing. We start from there. Isabella, I agree with you. That needs to be the first start, is what is the constitutional mandate? Why does government exist if it is not to ensure that the rights of people are met? And it's really important from our side that the constitutional mandate guides the work that we do as DSD. You've seen the passion of our minister. It's inspirational to work with her. So I should probably have acknowledged her first, because if it wasn't for her, the work on BIG would never have, we would not have dusted off the document that had been done by the Taylor Committee 2002. She had the foresight to say, what next after the 350? And the answer that she got, then she said, let's push it, because as a lot of people have said, the BIG is an idea whose time has come. So the work we've done today is that how we want to use it is to then infuse it into the policy proposal that you are making. You understand that we want to really make evidence-based policy. So this is about building that evidence, and not only the work that we have done ourselves, but all the work that all the different civil society groups have done. Some who I met only last week. I only met Dominic last week. So there's a lot of commitment in the country to ensure that we do address the income needs of poor people in the country. General Moyo, you know, the things that you say go straight to the motivation for why we must do what we're doing. And the battles that you are facing, we are fighting. We know that you're also fighting on your platform. The reason we asked you to come here was so that those people who don't get to hear you also get to hear what it's like at the coalface. We think it's as important as the technical, high-end economics complex work. We think the two must balance each other, and that's why we also brought you here. We'll continue to bring civil society groups and the people who are the recipients of the benefits to tell us the other side of it, so that we don't become very academic and very clever, but actually not address the lived experiences of people. So I'm very thankful for the session we've had today. We are going to infuse it, as I said, in the policy proposals we are taking to cabinet, so that the decisions can be made. And once those decisions are made, the pathway for us to get to a point of a basic income support is to say, let's build on what's in place, which is the 350 grant, hence the work that was being done. We then want to, over time, say, how do we then increase the value of the grant? Because, you know, we agree with you. 350 is not enough for anybody to live on. But it's a start, and we must build from what we have. We want to build on that. And then also, how do we expand coverage then to more and more people? Because this year we found ourselves in a very challenging position of having to reduce, because of the allocation that you were given, having to come up with those means tests, which then resulted in a reduction of the number of people who access the grant. So we share your concern. We share the concern of all South Africans to make sure that the levels of poverty in the country, we think they cannot be justified. This is not a poor country. The basic income support is affordable in this country. What we need to do is argue for it, keep pushing for it, and agree with Dominic that is not the only intervention, but it's critical. Even for the other services that government provides, the social protection benefits, access to water, sanitation, and so on, and even free healthcare. We know that if you don't have money to travel to the clinic, it doesn't matter that the clinic is free. It's irrelevant. So we must make sure that there's a combination of interventions, but the focus in this one is let's build on the 350 grant. Let's fight for it to be increased. Let's fight for it to become a permanent grant. And let's deal with the naysayers and their arguments about why it's not affordable, why there should be alternatives, and so on. So the point of the work today was to do exactly that, so that we can strengthen our argument from DSD side and move along with you. And we hope that you will continue to move along with us, everyone that is here. Thank you very much for the work today. I don't want to stand between you and lunch. Thank you. I declare the session closed and appreciate everyone here, especially the leadership of our Minister of Social Development, Minister Zulu. Thank you very much.
You're all still sitting down, so I guess you're waiting for me to confirm. Lunch is served and the program has officially ended. It's been a pleasure being with you today.
Section 27(1)(c) of the South African Constitution states that everyone has a right to have access to social security and appropriate social assistance, including and not limited to if they are unable to support themselves and their dependents. Social assistance is funded by government revenue. This is what is referred to as social grants to vulnerable children, the elderly, and those with disabilities, administered and distributed by the Department of Social Development through its agency, South African Social Security Agency, SASSA.
When we talk about social security, we mean basically all the interventions that government has in place in order to address poverty, income poverty of people in the country. That means, from the definition that the Taylor Committee gave us in 2002, that we not only alleviate poverty in the form of social grants, but we also try to prevent poverty through creating mechanisms for people to actually save ahead of time for themselves through institutions such as the Unemployment Insurance Fund, the Compensation Fund for Occupational Injuries and Diseases, and also the Road Accident Fund. So when we talk social security, it's not only grants. There are three elements to it. It's the social grants, which is the social assistance program funded by government through general taxes. And then there's contributions that people make through funds that are established in legislation such as the Unemployment Insurance Fund, the Compensation Fund, and the Road Accident Fund. Those are mandatory funds to which people contribute.
Currently, the department spends about 3.5 billion rands per month, providing support to about 10.5 million people.
The Department of Social Development writes the policy on the different kinds of grants. The primary focus of those ones is for people who are vulnerable in the country. We have social grants for children from the age 0 all the way up to age 18, children who come from poor families. So the department has those child support grants. We also have foster child grants for children who have lost a parent, who are living with people who are not their biological parents. So the foster child grant is another kind of grant that we give. The other grant is the disability grant for persons with disability. We provide disability grants for children and also for adults. And the disability grant is also given on a temporary basis, but also we have the permanent one for people with permanent disability. Then we have the older persons grant, which is the one that is the most famous, the one that the gogos go in queue for. That's the old age grant.
We visited Gogo Mildred Mtlalose, a 95-year-old pensioner living in Soweto. Gogo Mildred is a recipient of the social grant meant for the elderly.
Mina uMildred Mtlalose, ngihlala ezone 689. Ngiyahola. Igrant ka-1 sengikhohliwe manje ukuthi 1,800. Le grant le ngiphiliswa yiyo ngoba ngisenabantwana. Yiyo esingiphilisa ngibhadale ogesi katufile khona manje sakhipha imali enkulu 200. Ukudla endlini. Abafana laba baphilanga banesifo sokuwa. Umfana yedwa wentombi yami. Konke kubheke mina ngisenamntwana, abantwana abayinani base Avalon. Noyise nomakoti. Sengisele nabantwana abathathu abasebenzi. Lo munye uyagula naye. Sengisele nale ntombazane engibhekile la endlini. iyangiphelele evikini lokugcina ngihambe ngiboleke komakhelwane abanosizo ngiyibuyisele mangihola njengoba izobe ngibabuyisele ngiboleke kubo.
In 2020, the unthinkable happened.
The National Coronavirus Command Council has decided to enforce a nationwide lockdown. To reach the most vulnerable families in our country, we have decided on a temporary 6-month coronavirus grant.
So the COVID-19 grant, the SRD grant that was introduced, was intended to support people of working age who did not have any means of supporting themselves during the period. So it was given to South Africans, but because there were also people in the country who are non-South Africans, who are asylum seekers, and those who are from Zimbabwe and Lesotho, who are permitted to be in the country, they have special permits to be in the country. They were also included because they were also in the same situation of not being able to work and not being able to survive without some sort of income support. So they were added to the beneficiaries that would access the 350 grant. So basically, those who were legally in the country at that time and could not work for themselves, they are also included in that 350 grant allocation. Initially, the allocation that was given was for around 6 million people, but then because COVID got extended, the grant was given from April up until October of 2020. Then because COVID went on for much longer than we thought, and the lockdown also went on for much longer than we thought, a decision was taken to extend the provision of the grant all the way up to April again of 2021. So after that, it became clear that because of COVID and its impact on the economy, the unemployment rates were continuing to grow and poverty levels were continuing to grow. Cost of living and cost of food was getting higher. So there was a much greater risk of people really falling into hunger. So the decision was taken to extend the grant even further. So now the grant, this 350 grant has been extended all the way up to the end of the financial year now, March 2022. That's when the grant will be concluded in order to continue to provide the support that people continue to need.